16 and all the way through the age of very close to 60. He retired a chief petty officer. When we buried him, he had over a dozen medals on his chest. We buried him in Walcott, New York, because Rochester, where he was born, the cemetery would no longer allow headstones because the gravekeepers were getting lazier and lazier. We're trying to restrict everything to markers for new internees. So we buried him in Walcott because he had a gravestone that was provided by the Veterans Administration that showed that he was in 3 legally recognized conflicts in the United States: World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, which is what it says on his tombstone. Now, because he had all of this behind him, I, as a military dependent, had the ability to access facilities such as the Post Exchange, the commissary, the library. I was a patient. Whenever I needed to be a patient, I would be admitted. Or places like the library, etc. But it doesn't mean that you're supposed to be accessing very high level security issues or papers or documents, etc. Much of what I accessed was based on the absolute laziness, incompetence, corruption of the military system, the Department of Defense, and the United States government itself, which most people have no comprehension of just how corrupt and broken down that system is. Literally, it does not function. It does not function. I cannot overemphasize that. Every day that an American citizen of the United States looks out that window and doesn't see rapine and riot and just cannibalism in the streets is a blessed day. Every day you don't see that as a blessed day. That's how much on the precipice this government system is. It's just, it's so corroded that it's like an infrastructure that's so eroded, one good kick from the outside or inside will send it all collapsing. Wow. That's how bad the situation is. But in terms of the hospital itself, Letterman Army Medical Center, because it was decisive into why Aquino selected myself as his liaison. What had happened was that when I was about 14 years of age, I suffered a bleeding duodenal ulcers. I was under an enormous amount of stress at that time due to having grown up in the San Francisco 10. Violence, in terms of filth, depravity, and amidst all that depravity, I had to join in Asian Pacific Islander American gangs to maintain my safety and prevent myself from being gang raped, assaulted to death. That was my security infrastructure. So it's very similar to what someone does in a prison environment. Right. So all of that stress led to bleeding duodenal ulcers, which were recognized as stress related in those days. This was prior to the discovery of the H. pylori virus, which was essentially is very much a sham in a very real sense. An MD in Australia injected himself repeatedly. This is very important to emphasize. Injected himself repeatedly with H. pylori virus to infect himself with bleeding duodenal ulcers. And that's how aggressive one has to be with that virus to create a bleeding duodenal ulcer intentionally. Now, after he did that, all psychiatric and psychological affiliations with bleeding duodenal ulcers disappeared. And what happens is these days they don't treat you for stress when you get a bleeding duodenal ulcer. They simply hand you an antibiotic for the H. pylori virus. Right. And all of that, of course, took away the reality that the people suffering this were paramedics, chief executive officers, CEOs, people who had positions of enormous stress. They weren't being treated for the stress. That was not the case when I was young. So when I was young, it was recognized immediately that my bleeding duodenal ulcers were caused because my immune system broke down with stress, which led to my body being vulnerable to the H. pylori virus, which was not yet identified or named. So certainly not in public, not in the general public. Might have been suspected in the military medical community. Very important to emphasize, the military medical community does not follow the Hippocratic Oath. People don't understand this. When it comes to the military MDs, they go through an education that's paid for by the United States government, and therefore they are beholden to the United States military, that branch of the government, which has paid for the medical education. And as being responsible towards that chain of command, they do not uphold the Hippocratic Oath. They never swear it. And therefore, they can do things as medical MDs, such as experiment on people with impunity. So they had an unholy alliance with the California state prison system. And the California state prison system is so enormous because the population and economy of California is so enormous that the California police force in the entire world. That's how powerful the prison union is. The governor of California, prison guards union, all of them cooperated with the U.S. Army at the Presidio military base to provide experimental subjects on the basis that these subjects would be given gubernatorial pardons from death sentences, revocation of life sentences, the shortening of sentences, even prison privileges, depending on how dangerous the experiment was. These people would therefore enter human experimentation. They'd sign their rights away. And many of them, hundreds, if not thousands, died at Letterman Army Medical Center in human experimentation. They didn't just stop at prisoners. They ultimately experimented with dependents like myself, because there was no way you could sue the United States government in those days. It was only when I exposed child molestation scandals at the Presidio that there began to be lawsuits against the U.S. Army, which is a branch of the United States government, which therefore was a lawsuit against the U.S. government. So I was a pioneer in ushering in this kind of change in public governmental relations because of what I exposed about the daycare scandals at the Presidio military base and child molestation scandals. Now, I could go through because prior to what I saw going down there at the daycare centers, I myself was an experimental subject at Letterman. They told my parents, your son's got bleed duodenal ulcer. He's going to bleed out. And there has been an enormous taint or corruption of the blood supply, which was quite true. At that period of time, you had an enormous amount of prostitutes, drug addicts, homeless people who were alcoholics, who were turning in their blood for money. They would get $20 for a pint of blood and a free donut. And this was going on all over the United States. All of the hepatitis, the syphilis, the chlamydia, the AIDS from all of these donors in the United States was destroying the blood supply. And at one point, the blood market crashed. It became so overtipped by all of these donors that were being paid to donate corrupted blood that wealthy people, children, various high profile down with AIDS and various other horrible diseases that were death sentences at that time. What the Army said was true. They said the blood supply is out, so we have a new experimental plasma. They literally used the term nanoplasma that we could try on your son, a synthetic blood. Every prisoner that we've experimented with, but your son is young and he's malleable. He's what they call pliable in the medical terms. Your son may be able to adapt to this. And my parents, given the choice of my dying or testing this out, gave the go-ahead. Now, the U.S. Army almost certainly lied. There was a doctor involved called Hagman, H-A-G-G-E-M-A-N, or Hagman, a colonel who later on got his medical license revoked because he was found to be experimenting on human subjects in retirement. And this was somebody who I followed because it turned out he was one of the people responsible for my blood transfusion. They took out every ounce of blood from my body and they replaced it with this synthetic plasma. Now, after that, I had what was deemed a photographic memory. There were difficulties, of course. First, I died. I was clinically dead for a period of at least 24 hours, perhaps 48. Then I essentially reanimated. And at that period of time, I was deathly pale because this was not normal hemoglobin. It was something that was basically white, and I was white, just as pale as a ghost. Very difficult for me to interact with my fellow Asians in my Asian Pacific Islander American community because white is the color of death. I was viewed as a vampire and a zombie. In terms of only my mother could love me. It was one of those situations. But the other result was collaterally, I seemed to have a phenomenal recall and memory after that, an ability to recall details in great detail that lasted for many decades. So it was for that reason I was ultimately selected as liaison to Colonel Michael Aquino for the work that he wanted to do. That was my involvement with him in terms of research and reference. I was also responsible for a lot of documents destruction, and also I would do illegal research for officers who were paying me to basically write their papers, what we used to call term papers in the civilian world. For them, it would be their promotional papers as they tried to move up through the ranks, and I would write their papers for them for review by their officers. So they wouldn't do any work. It's like paying someone else to do your term paper for you, or your master's thesis, or even your doctorate. So I did that for people all the way up to the level of people who were being promoted to the rank of general. So I know as much as any general in that regard, and far more, because I'm the one who did the research, whereas they did not. So in that regard, my ability to out-talk or outthink or outsmart pretty much any general in the United States military is a given. This is the kind of situation where I'm coming from and the authority with which I speak. So that's the kind of corruption that led to a collapse of a good deal of the military. People don't understand how it was collapsed even before I entered the scene. But hopefully that gives some background to what we were dealing with at the time that the Presidio military base was operational. One of the aspects that I learned about history, of course, was that of the Khazar Empire, the history of Israel, etc. And the reason that we got into such areas of what normally would be deemed archaeological or theological research was because of Michael Aquino. Michael Aquino, of course, was a practicing Satanist. Michael Aquino sells himself now as a former Satanist. In a sense, this is true. Michael Aquino's researches and his magics have gotten so dark that the devils themselves have rebuked him, and the Satanists in many cases have rebuked him. And that requires a outline of some of the cosmology that we're dealing with when it comes to demonology, diabolatry. There is, in a sense, just to put it briefly, and I'll use a Kabbalistic analogy or allegory because it serves us best. The original Judaic Kabbalah pictured a tree of life. Beneath this tree of life was a tree of death. Of the Sephiroth, or the divine spheres, there were the Klipoth, and the Klipoth were the shadows of the divine spheres. They were kind of like the roots of the tree of life, which was above ground, within the light, facing the light of God and divinity. That tree of death beneath is the sewers of this kind of system, but at the same time, it is the fertilization of this system. This is what God created in his divine wisdom as an ecosystem. Basically, these demons and these devils, as horrible as their intent may be, even if they seek as the shadows of that which is lighted as opposed to benighted, their cause of suffering amongst humans, their cause of the fall of many humans, is what leads to the fertilization of that which is above the ground. And because of that, they're almost like the dung beetles, the earthworms, the carrion, if you will, that leads to a refertilization of the tree of life. Therefore, everything that happens that a person suffers is in its own sense divine. When we experience these horrible things in life, these horrible challenges, it's very important to remember that this isn't because God is sadistic or bored and not there or has abandoned us. It's because he's created an ecosystem with which our suffering revitalizes that which is above that which is beneath those sewers of Satan or Satan, which Michael Aquino came to work with, because it's always easier for power mongers to reach down than it is to reach up. The overwhelming matter, the overwhelming majority of the universe is darkness. Far easier to work with that than that which is light. When it comes to all that we know and love, rainbows, butterflies, puppies, everything that makes life so beautiful and worthwhile, all of this is, in a sense, of the heavier elements that we can see and appreciate, and all of that constitutes far less than 1% of the entire physical universe. The overwhelming majority of that physical universe, which doesn't source from star stuff, the stars themselves are within that less than 1% of the physical universe. The overwhelming majority of that universe is darkness, dark matter, and for that reason, it is so easy for men like Michael Aquino to work with the darkness. This is why the left-hand path is so easy to take for immediate results. So much easier to reach for the fallen fruit than to reach up into the tree to pluck that which is fresh. So it's important to keep that in mind. Aquino has gone beyond that now with the researchers that were promoted by the US military when they began to research an anti-tree beyond the tree of life and death, an anti-matter tree, an anti-cosm, the failed cosms that were created before the divinity created our universe. And these failed cosms became the homes to anti-gods or entities, which of course wallowed in this nothingness that became the focus of attempts to contact and bring them into our universe by black budget projects in the US military, by Michael Aquino. At this point, this is beyond that of the diabolic and the angelic. And this is something which, of course, has brought Michael Aquino out of favor with normal diabolists who work within those sewer systems and into a different mode of evil entirely, along with his cultists and representatives. So those are the people who generally attack myself publicly as vociferously as possible, and they are people that even the devils, the demons, and the Satanists rebuke. That is the position at where we're at in the cosmic struggle. That is beyond what most people understand because they're still stuck in the ecosystem that they comprehend, and understandably so. So the cosmology is a bit more complicated than most people understand. And as we go into that Jewish origins of that cosmology through that Kabbalistic system, we come out of it to something that's more mundane, which is the Hazar Empire itself, the concept of Judaism, and much of the misconception of Judaism and Christianity by many Americans in particular, Westerners in general. But that's something that I'll happily go into now. Where the origins of that term came from, why the synagogue of Satan would be, from my perception, far more the United States than even Israel itself, which is a symptom of the American empire and its support of Israel as we understand it today. And Israel is, of course, very much a rogue state, and it is very much a system that most people don't understand at all in terms of its history, its politics, nor do they understand the people that comprise the population of Israel in the main, and exactly what that's about. So we'll happily go into that now. Very important to remember that in terms of the original Jewish populations, they were heavily involved with, of course, that which comprises our Old Testament. And our Old Testament is radically different from that which comprises our New Testament. And of course, a child looking at that and being taught the Bible would say that God got nicer as he got older. That somehow the New Testament seems to be far more loving, far more caring for humanity than that of the Old Testament. And that's because the God of the Old Testament is very much a God of the Hebrews, a tribal God. And it's very much a God that demands, in a very real sense, blood sacrifice, the sacrifices of children. It's not the God we know and understand as Christians, because it took the divinity to enter the flesh as a man to understand what humanity suffers, to really comprehend what humanity suffers, and to interact with humanity and express his love for them. And it was during that time that he did this that the whole interaction between the divinity and humanity itself changed so much that we changed the entire calendar system because of it. So this, of course, was during a time when the tribes became scattered, which was actually at that time. They started to be scattered before the time of Christ. And the tribes scattered, of course, all over the world. Many of them scattered to Africa. Many of them scattered to Asia. And most Americans are entirely unfamiliar with this. And many of them scattered to Albion, or the Isles of Britain. What happened was, during that period of time, of course, we had now the lost tribes of Judea, but people tend to think of one lost tribe. They tend to think of, oh, there might be a lost tribe somewhere that might be rediscovered. These days, we don't have the medievalist vision of a lost tribe of a coherent civilization. These days, we interpret that as DNA. How do we find the DNA of these Jewish people in Africa, where it's been found, in India, where it's been found, and whatnot. So this kind of mystery has gone into the realm of science. And what people do is they pursue that, sometimes for reasons of becoming Israeli citizens, because Israel is supposed to accept people who are able to prove that they're genetically attached to the original Semitic Jews. This is all quite ironic, because the majority of people who comprise the population of Israel, who are white Israelis, are not at all Semitic. So they create these policies as part of an apartheid policy, and it gives the world the impression that they are what they claim to be, which they are not. If indeed the case may be argued quite beyond compellingly, the case is basically airtight, it's vacuum sealed. The Ethiopian Jews who are persecuted and often ostracized in Israel are far more Jewish than the Israelis that we typify as Israelis. And the same with many other quote-unquote minorities in Israel. So that brings us to the term anti-Semitic. Before I get back to the Hazar, the term anti-Semitic is an entirely hijacked term by the modern Jewish culture. It makes absolutely no sense, because Semites are, of course, a very specific ethnicity of the desert. The majority of people who are Semitic are, of course, Arabic. The Palestinians are Semitic. The Arabic peoples are Semitic. This makes Israel the most anti-Semitic nation on earth. If we're talking about a kind of reaction to Jewish atrocities, a kind of a reaction that might be pathological. If people begin to interpret Jews as responsible for all ills in the world beyond a rational sense, the correct term for that would be Judeophobia. So there are Judeophobic peoples, and we don't want to veer into Judeophobia. And I know many people will be skeptical about that, considering all that I'm exposing about Judaism. But the reality is, Judeophobia would be if I personally began to hold Jews responsible for multiple ills that are beyond any normal human control. So obviously, that level of phobic behavior is to be avoided and hopefully educated out of the population. But nevertheless, the reality of history is replete with atrocities that source very often from the Jewish peoples in the past, all the way into our modern age. And they have perverted our modern age in terms of their impacts in a way most people don't understand. And much of this starts with that kind of understanding they had with the Old Testament interpretation of their God. In that period of time, it's important to remember other ancient civilizations existed aside from the Judaic. The Hellenic in particular, the Hellenes, or the Helleniki, the Greek peoples, or the classical Grecian peoples existed. And it is from them that the Jews inherited a term that was to describe their version of jihad, or their version of crusade. Now, these words, of course, are highly controversial, and they have separate meanings as well as that of military action. A personal jihad could be a kind of campaign for truth in the Muslim world, or it could be a very personal quest, a person on a jihad, a personal kind of Islamic enlightenment. Crusade, of course, can be used for a fundraiser in a Christian church. We're on a fundraising crusade. But in reality, these terms were originally militarily operational terms. Jihad was basically a military campaign, very much so, and still retains that meaning correctly to this day. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Crusade still meant very much a military campaign. That's why the Allies were abusing that term, saying crusade in Europe, even though there was no religious intent behind what the Allies were perpetrating in Europe. Then you have, of course, the term Holocaust. Now that, of course, is the Greek term for a total burning, a burning of someone or something so totally that no remains left, no cremains or cremated remains are left for to be wasted. They're scattered to the winds as an offering to Yahweh, or the ancient tribal Judaic interpretation of the Old Testament God. So that Old Testament God is very different from your God if you are a Christian. As a Christian God, your God is that of the New Testament. And to put this in some allegory, a proper analogy for many Christians, our Bible is replete, of course, with excisions. Much of the Bible has been corrupted by the churches. The Byzantine Orthodox Church, of which I am a member of the Serbian Orthodox Church, and of course we have the Church of the Roman Catholics, in particular the Byzantine Orthodox Church and the later the Roman Catholics, but particularly the Byzantine Orthodox, since they were actually the first church of the converted or Christianized Roman Empire. The Council of Nicaea and various other church august bodies of authority began to censor the Bible. They began to take out aspects of the Bible that they felt were just not needed or somehow threatening to their agenda. Much of this is made famous, of course, through the Apocrypha. And therefore, if one wants a complete Bible, Bibles are offered with the integrated Apocrypha, or at least Appendix Apocrypha. This is important. It contains books from Ethiopia that are not in the regular Bible. Another thing that needs to be brought up about the Bible in terms of its Old Testament and New Testament is that a good analogy would be history and historical novels. A great aspect of this would be, or a great way to present this would be my late and sainted father, who was a sailor, very much a nautical enthusiast and a mariner, loved history about the sea, and he was a fan of both books, Moby Dick and The Mutiny on the Bounty. If you were to put those two books together simply because they had a nautical theme, the problem is that Moby Dick is what's called faction. It is based on fact, a genuine historical incident, but Moby Dick has been fictionalized. So this faction is very different from the non-fiction of The Mutiny on the Bounty, which is actual straight history, a historical account of an actual incident. If you put those two books together and said one is Old Testament, one is New Testament, the New Testament, that of The Mutiny on the Bounty, needs to be interpreted completely within context of the Old Testament. Then you're getting a factional interpretation of what is in the historical book, The Mutiny on the Bounty. Now, if you were to interpret that to a different language and combine censorship, it would get even more confusing. That is what has happened to the Bible. You've had an Old Testament which inescapably has incorporated many aspects of the original Southwest Asian cultures of the Levantine, the Canaanites, the Edomites, various other peoples, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Sumerians. Many of the creation myths are the source for much of what we see in Genesis. They're very compatible in many ways. So you have this kind of biblicization of some of the regional cultures in the Old Testament, and a God that is very demanding and bloodthirsty, as all of those regional gods were in the Old Testament. The God of Christ has signed a covenant not with the Israel of the Judaic tribes. His covenant is with the Israel of all humanity. So the God of the New Testament has signed a covenant, or presented a covenant, with everyone, with all humanity. And that is why the God of the New Testament is so different. So these are operative understandings that need to be maintained in light of what was going on when the original dispersed Israelites who were taken out of Egypt were confronted with finding a new home in the desert, and they encountered Canaan, or migrated towards Canaan. Canaan, of course, was on the Levantine, it was on the coast, and the Canaanites were a civilization that held the land dearly, and in order to displace them, the original Judaic tribes held a proper Holocaust. That, again, their version of jihad or crusade. Only their Holocaust demanded the incineration of all people and objects on site as an offering up to their God. This was the first Holocaust. So when the Jewish people invaded Canaan, took Canaan and turned it into Israel, it was the product of the original Holocaust. All of the women and children, the men, the buildings, the animals were burned in an offering to God so that they could ultimately take the land and claim it as their own. This term was later used when they were campaigning to convert others to their religion. And that's what people don't understand. Judaism is, of course, not just an ethnos. It is also a religion. Within that religion, there are already two major ethnicities. One of them is, of course, Ashkenazim. The other is Sephardim. And the Sephardim are Semitic. The Ashkenazim are not. They are Turkic. Right. And all of the Israelites of the state of Israel today, overwhelmingly, are Ashkenazim, which means they are overwhelmingly Turkic in ethnicity, which means they truly are of a different ethnos than the Palestinians or the Arab peoples around them. This is why their actions as foreigners.
And this has been proven by DNA, correct?
Yes, that is quite so. The first man to actually do research on this and expose this to the public was himself Jewish. He was Arthur Koestler. Arthur Koestler is a profoundly respected Jewish academician of impeccable credentials who wrote a book called The 13th Tribe. And the 13th Tribe described the fact that what happened was in the days of the ancient Judaic Empire. We're talking about when we had King David, when we had the real regional superpower based on the first Holocaust and the consumption of that land, the conversion of it by force, the eradication of the original population. These Jews who were Semitic ethnically went on a crusade to convert non-Semitic peoples to Judaism. Now, one of the peoples they converted was a Caucasian race of Turkic peoples in the Caucasus Mountains. The Caucasus Mountains are, of course, where we get the term Caucasian from. They come from the Caucasus Mountains. Now, this doesn't mean that Turks are, quote unquote, the true Caucasians. They are simply a variant of Caucasoid peoples. Obviously, European peoples are Caucasian. But the Turks are also Caucasian of a different ethnos, of a different ethnicity. And so these Turkic tribes were militant, they were warlike, yet they were not as organized or aggressive or religiously motivated as the original Semitic Jews. And the original Semitic Jews campaigned, defeated them militarily, converted them to Judaism by force, and that was the birth of the Khazar. The Khazar Empire stretched up throughout Tartaria, or the Caucasian Peninsula, what we could think of as that isthmus between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and into what today we would designate as Ukraine or Ukraine, the borderland, or Belarus, which is White Russia. So when the Khazar tribes conquered these areas, they enslaved all of these other Caucasian peoples who were Slavic. And that's how the term Slav became equated with the term slave. It also, it's important to emphasize, as a member of the Serbian Orthodox Church, Slava means celebration. They use their sufferings as part of their commiseration or the communion with the Christianity and the sufferings that are equated with Christianity, and therefore Slava also means celebration, but also it is the source for the term slave, where it comes from, which were originally, of course, Caucasian whites of Eastern European ethnicities. Now, later on in history, these slaves were taken over by other European powers, primarily the Lithuanians and the Polaki, or what Americans call the Poles. By the way, that's an inappropriate term. To call a Polish person a Pole would be like referring to someone from Holland as a whole. It's actually quite offensive, so the correct term for them in their language is Polaki. So the Polaki peoples, the Polish peoples, and the Lithuanian peoples developed these massive empires after they defeated the Khazar. And these empires created what we know as White Russia, or Belarus, and Ukraine, the Ukrainian region today. The difference between the Ukrainians and the White Russians, or the Belarusians, is who was enslaved by whom. The Ukrainians, in general, were enslaved by either the Polaki or the Lithuanians, one or the other, and the Belarusians were enslaved by the other European power. Both of these nations were created by slaving empires, Slavocracies, that had defeated the Khazar Empire of Judaified Turkish peoples. When they were defeated, the Judaified Turkish peoples became a diaspora, and they resettled in ghettos throughout Eastern Europe as the Ashkenazi. And so these Ashkenazi peoples are, of course, the peoples who, after the Holocaust in Europe, migrated into Palestine and occupied Palestine. So these peoples are not at all the Jews of the Bible. They are not the Semitic peoples that were dealing with the Old Testament God, who is not your Christian God. Your Christian God is the God of the New Testament. The Old Testament is a cultural upload prior to the Christianization and the pact with humanity and the covenant that makes us Christians who practice Christianity. So in terms of what we have is this situation where the Americans unquestioningly and unswervingly, because of propaganda and indoctrination, accept the peoples of Israel, the Ashkenazi peoples, as the Jews of the Bible, then they support them wholeheartedly and fanatically. And the problem is because they identify these people as the chosen people, which of course they are not. These are people who are converts. They are posiers. This is imposture.
Right.
And these imposturing peoples have hijacked the American mindset to create a new religion, which is Jew worship. So in America, the overwhelming majority of Americans who claim to be Christian don't follow Christ at all. They worship the Jew. And so this can manifest in any number of ways, primarily by military support, by the demands on everyone else that we stand by with Israel, right or wrong, that everything has to be invested in Israel. Now, I, of course, am not arguing for the dissolution of the Jewish state, but I do argue for radical changes and geographic changes that would make it radically smaller. I do argue for that, which many Jews would consider as much as arguing for the disappearance of the Jewish state. But let's try and get this into some balance as to the realities, of course, of diplomacy, the attempts to prevent Holocaust from happening again, while at the same time recognizing that the Jewish people of Israel, the Khazars, are generating a Holocaust of their own against the Palestinians. The very term Holocaust, which Americans use all the time to reference to Jewish eradication or ethnic cleansing in Europe, is not used by the Hebrew-speaking Jewish peoples or Israelis. They use the term Hashawa, or the catastrophe. The Palestinians who were massacred by the Jews who established this foreign white settler regime in Palestine, the Palestinians refer to the million people who were exterminated at that time. They refer to that as al-Nakba, or the catastrophe. So we have two catastrophes upon another. The Holocaust in Europe, we have Hashoah, as it's referred to by the Jews, and then we've got al-Nakba, which the Jews themselves thereafter committed directly against the Palestinian peoples. Now, of course, the Jews were responsible for much crime in Europe in terms of mass genocide after the Second World War, which we can get into in a period of time through this discussion as shortly as possible, of course. But the reality is that people need to remember Israel is a white settler regime. It is Turkic. They are ethnically Turkic. They are not Semitic. And of course, they maintain an apartheid state. Their apartheid state extends not only to Palestinians, it extends to Ethiopian Jews or any other real Jew who is Semitic. So you have an artificial facade that is not recognized by any legal government in the world. Now, here's how confused Americans are and how ignorant they are. If they look up any dictionary or they consult any encyclopedia and they look up Israel, and they look it up as a modern state, they're going to find the definition in the Webster's Dictionary, in the Encyclopedia Britannica. They're going to see Israel, capital of that state is Jerusalem, or as the Hebrew pronunciation is Yerushalayim. That is a lie. It is not accepted by any government in the world.
Right.
Every single government in the world does not recognize Jerusalem as the capital of the state of Israel, because every single government in the world, from Canada to the United States to the former Soviet Union, now Russia, to Japan, anywhere in the world, they recognize the government of the illegal apartheid state of white settler occupation of Palestine as Tel Aviv-Yafo. Tel Aviv-Yafo is, of course, the financial capital of Israel. So when you have Israel, and you look up where the embassies are, very important to differentiate between embassies and consulates. Embassies are, of course, where you have legal recognition of the capital region of a nation state. Yet, what you would have as the other diplomatic kind of recognition, which would be a consulate in the papal or Vatican state, they would call it a nuncio. This would be in areas that are not the capital. So there are international consulates in San Francisco for almost all the nations in the world. San Francisco is a very complicated, very cosmopolitan city. New York City would be another example. Any major city is going to have consulates of the majority of the major nations on Earth. Right. San Francisco and New York would have the majority of nations on Earth would have a consulate in these areas. But the embassies would be in Washington, D.C. or the District of Columbia. So too with the embassies in Israel. In Israel, all the embassies are in Tel Aviv-Yafo, ironically enough, the financial capital of the state of Israel, because they recognize it as an illegal apartheid regime that is maintained by a white settler population by dint of force, and that it is not a natural population. All your governments in the world know this, but you don't know this. And you don't know this because whenever you consult the web, whenever you consult your encyclopedia, whenever you consult your dictionary, you get propagandistic misinformation that Jerusalem is the capital, where all the consulates are. The consulates in Israel would be in a place like Jerusalem. So that is the horror of the ignorance that Americans suffer from. By the way, just so people understand, there are only 2 nations in the world which do have embassies in Jerusalem that were literally, for all intents and purposes, purchased lock, stock, and barrel as populations by Israel. One of them is Costa Rica, I believe, I think, or the other one might be Ecuador or something like that. People can look this up and they can correct me. Guatemala. These are like 2 little chicken shit banana republics that are basically somewhere in Central America that have literally, for all intents and purposes, were purchased, but literally purchased outright by Israel. Israel owns them. And so their embassies are in Jerusalem. That's the only 2 nations in the world that have that. But any nation on earth that matters, any population that matters, I understand all lives matter, but you understand what I'm saying.
Exactly.
Any economic powerhouse or real nation, I'll say that, has its embassies in Tel Aviv-Yafo. So this is the situation which we have in Israel today. Beyond that, most Americans have no comprehension of this. The majority of the population of Israel has suffered a radical sea change since the collapse of the Soviet Union. It has had an enormous influx of Russian Jews. And the Russian Jews, of course, first all migrated to the United States. None of them wanted to go to Israel because you're required to serve in the military. None of them wanted to do a stint in the military. So they all went to the United States until the United States finally couldn't handle them anymore because they were destroying the welfare system. They were burdening, they were actually going into places that were meant for emergency storage of foods and medical products, etc., that were meant for basically national emergencies. And they cleared all those places out. They literally cleaned out all of our national emergency supplies, which is why we have nothing to be prepared with for Katrina or anything else that has taken place since Katrina, is because much of these supply centers in major cities were cleared out by the Russian Jewish immigrants who came into the United States. It's a true story, by the way. I know because I dealt with the records. So, and so all of that was just taken by all of these immigrants. And finally, the United States said, they're breaking us. And they said, we literally cannot handle this form of parasitism. You, Israel, have to take these Russian Jews. So Israel took in the other Russian Jews. They had to go straight to Israel after that. The population of Israel today is 1/3 Russian. The major language of Israel is the Umgangssprache in many cities in Israel. Umgangssprache meaning the language of choice, the lingua franca, the language which everyone speaks, is Russian.
Wow.
They don't speak Hebrew. So these are the swing vote in Israel, is these Russians in Israel today that are the swing vote for any decisive vote in Israel. So that is Israel today. It is either Turkic or it's Russian Slavic with some tint of Jewish blood. And then you've got other people who are essentially kind of ostracized, who are Ethiopian Jews, etc., or other kinds of Sephardi minorities. So it is a madhouse that is also an armed camp. And we'll get into how much of a madhouse it truly is. Not necessarily that I want to dwell on the domestic politics of Israel at all, but that should give people a kind of impression of what this monstrosity that they're supporting is. And we'll get a bit more into that. But since the collapse of the Khazar Empire, what happened was, of course, you had the diaspora, which spread into Eastern Europe in all of the ghettos, spread into the rest of Europe after that. And then the diaspora began desperately looking for a place to develop a Jewish nation, to develop a nation that would be a collective state for the Jewish peoples. Now, one can hardly fault them for that. One can hardly blame them. But we are talking about a people who think on Old Testament terms. Jews are not concerned with the Bible. If people don't understand this, I'll try and give them an example of how different the Jewish mindset truly is to the way a Christian thinks. One of the things that people have to understand is that as Christians, of course, they are enamored of Bethlehem, and rightly so. It was in a cave, not a manger, in Bethlehem that Christ was born, that our God came to us. And it was out of that cave that emerged the light of the world. Now, all of this was something that could have been destroyed, potentially, by one man known as Herod the Great. And Herod the Great was, of course, the king of Israel at that time that Christ was born. Herod, of course, was a pathological, murderous, sociopathic individual who was very good at motivating economic projects that created employment, which were megastructures. He was very engaged in archaeological, what would become archaeological sites, megalithic structuring. And because he created such enormous works of architectural structure, he is now considered very much a kind of superhero in Israel. It doesn't matter to the Jewish people that King Herod killed his wives, his sons, and according to the New Testament, in his search to kill your God, Christ, he killed all the male newborns in Bethlehem. Now, this individual, of course, has an exhibit at the Israel Museum in his honor. It was seriously considered that his likeness be placed on Israeli currency. And one of the reasons why is because we have an individual who renovated the second temple in Jerusalem, which according to the Talmud is one of the most beautiful buildings on earth. He built Masada, where there was that Jewish last stand. He built Caesarea, what Americans call Caesarea. Whoever has not seen Herod's building has not seen a beautiful building in his life, according to the Talmud. His Jewishness was actually questionable. He was of Idumean nationality or origin. His great-grandfather was converted to Judaism in one of those Holocausts. His mother was Nabatean. So in the eyes of pious Jews, Herod was someone who was Hellenizing or Greekifying Judea. But the Talmud, which basically belittles his status in that sense, calling him a slave of the house of the Hasmoneans, which was the ruling dynasty that preceded his, basically, he still was the dude who renovated the Jews' temple after he killed a bunch of rabbis. Now, the interesting thing is that the God of the Old Testament never punished him for it. So because he doesn't serve as a morality tale where he was punished by the God of the Jews, because he didn't incur the wrath of his God, his behavior is something that is considered acceptable. And he produced an enormous amount of structures in stone that can be shown off to tourists all over Israel. So he gave the people of the book an opportunity to also be the people of the stone, with temples and palaces that they can show off to tourists about their history, just like any other nation. So that is what makes Herod the superhero in Jewish eyes, in Israel, in Israeli eyes, who's the very man who wanted to kill your God if you're a Christian.
Right.
So this is how different the mindset is of an Israeli from a Christian, particularly a Christian American. But the Christian American doesn't care. The Christian American thinks in these terms, that I saw the movie Moses, and Charlton Heston portrayed Moses, and he looks like a decent white guy, and he's this Joe who looks American to me, and he speaks American English with an American accent, not that funny British type, you know, like Jean-Luc Picard on Star Trek. So I can really relate to this guy. And this guy, you know, who became an industrial strength Republican, you know, he led his people to the promised land. And therefore, all these Jews, you know, who are the people of God, because I saw it in the films, these Jews are of God. So every Jew in the eye of your average American is like a miniature Jesus Christ. In the eyes of an average American is a relative of the boss. So to an American, if you're Jewish, you're a relative of the boss, and they will bend over backwards to do anything for you so they can, if you're Jewish, so they can raise brownie points with God. So they think that by supplicating, serving the Jew, whoever doubts this, a great example is Roman Polanski. Just as a character example, you have Roman Polanski, who survived the Konzentrationslager, the concentration camps of the Third Reich. Roman Polanski is a child molester. Roman Polanski drugged an underage girl who continually told him no and raped her repeatedly. Roman Polanski had to escape the United States to avoid imprisonment, went to Europe, and to avoid extradition. He came back to the United States to personally open a Holocaust Memorial Museum. So when he came back to the United States to open a Holocaust Memorial Museum, the American authorities stepped in and they were going to arrest him. And at that time, the Jewish community got into an uproar and said, you can't arrest him. He's opening a Holocaust Memorial Museum, the terrible sacrifice of our people. And so the Americans backed down and they let a child molester open a museum in the United States and go free. And all the American Christians said, we love it because he's Jewish. I would give my daughter for him to rape. I would give my son for him to rape.
Yeah.
Your average American would give their firstborn baby for a Jew to rape any day of the week because they worship the Jew, because to them, the Jew is God. Whoever doesn't believe this, just take a look at Hollywood and who portrayed God in Joan of Arc. Oh, here's a movie they make of Joan of Arc, the saint of the Roman Catholic Church, and Joan d'Arc is this martyr of Christendom. And here she is in the film. She meets God. Who's God? Dustin Hoffman, this Yoda-like Jew, comes along and says, I'm God, and I'm Jewish, and worship me. That's what he says to the masses who are watching Jeanne d'Arc in the theaters. And that's because Americans confuse celebrity with divinity. And so if they don't recognize this, just take a look at the other movie of Jeanne d'Arc that was made for television, this television miniseries. And Joan of Arc sees an angel. And who's the angel who comes to see her? Meryl Streep of Dancing in the Light. And Meryl Streep is portrayed as the angel. She looks hideous, by the way. She comes down from the sky and presents this sword to Jeanne d'Arc. And they say, here's this, new age individual. This is an angel. This is what angels look like, is what they're trying to tell you. And so Americans say, oh, well, she's a celebrity. I recognize her. That she must be an angel because she's a celebrity. And so, by confusion of celebrity with divinity, that reinforces the worship of the Jew because the majority of celebrities are Jewish. So since the majority of media and is dominated by a lot of Jewish nepotism, or was for a very long period of time, that's come to an end, by the way. Hollywood is now divided by three very powerful interest groups, one of them being Scientology, the other being the homosexual lobby, and then the other third being Jews.
Right.
Basically, there's a lot of infighting in Hollywood now that never existed before. So the Jewish lockdown on media has disintegrated, which is why we're able to talk today, and is why many people have begun to realize the atrocities taking place in Palestine. It's why many people are opening up to the atrocities of Israel. But in the meantime, your average American, of course, does not. He worships celebrity, and he or she accepts Israel as being the nation of God because they believe that all Jews are relatives of the boss. And they take a look at portrayals of God by Dustin Hoffman and Angels by Meryl Streep, and they say, well, I believe that, you know, people in heaven look like Jews. And so to them, as soon as a Jew walks into a room, then they pretty much grant him whatever he wants. They don't argue with him. They accept what he says. And that is the American cult, the religion of Jew worship. So that is the American religion. It's not Christianity. And that is what we're here to fight today and what we've been fighting all along. So what Christians need to do is to educate themselves, of course, in Christianity and realize that it has very little to do with their worship of the Jew. So that, I think, now that we've gotten that out of the way,
Yeah.
we can go into some of the other aspects of Jewish atrocity and why they are so misunderstood by Americans, why they're so ignored. A great example of this is, of course, the atrocities of Christopher Columbus, the worst of all Jewish holocausts. So terrible, it changed the climate of the earth itself. And during the time of Christopher Colombueno, you had, of course, the king and queen of Spain, and you had the Inquisition. Now, the Inquisition was, of course, forcing the conversion of Jews to Catholicism, Roman Catholicism in particular, or what in general in that day was accepted as the majority of Western Christendom, or Christianity. Now, when all of this was taking place, the Jews were desperately and understandably seeking to avoid such persecution, and they began to seek a new home in the world. Christopher Columbus was, of course, quintessential to that. And Christopher Columbus is someone who was a Morano. And a Morano in the Espanol, or the Spanish, simply means dirty pig. And that's because, of course, they would use that term on Jews who falsely converted to Christianity because they were considered people who refrained from eating pork. And because they refrained from eating pork and only did so if they converted to Christianity, those who pretended to convert to Christianity started eating pork but were deceptive about it and were still practicing Judaism. They were looked on as these horrible hypocrites that were referred to as Moranos, or dirty pigs. Now that name, or that epithet, it fitted Columbus directly, perfectly, because that's exactly what he was. He was someone who, of course, operated on the knowledge of others. He already knew, as people had done for centuries, that the world was round. He got many charts that were provided ultimately from the original man who circumnavigated the world, the Chinese admiral of the treasure fleet. And this admiral, of course, ultimately had papers that made it into Europe during the times of Leonardo da Vinci and the Renaissance. Now, all of this was known simultaneous and parallel to the discovery of the New World. So we had, at that period of time, Columbus knowing that he would find a new land. He was not looking for Asia, and that is the common myth. It's propagandistic. He, of course, told people he was seeking lands that were filled with gold that he could use towards the reclamation of Jerusalem. The Catholic Church approved of that, And the Catholic Church thought that he was doing this for reasons of his conversion to Christianity, but that was not the case at all. This so-called Asiatic expedition to America was funded not by the Queen of Spain, or España in the proper verbiage. It was funded by 3 prominent Jews, 2 wealthy Jewish merchants, one of them named Luis de Santiago, another one named Gabriel Sanchez, and a rabbi by the name of Don Isaac El Rabano. And altogether, they fronted about 17,000 ducats, which was a fortune in those days. And he would update them on the progress of his voyage to the New World before he updated the King and Queen of Spain. The first 2 letters written by Columbus were sent to his backers, not the royal couple, revealing what he had found, thanking them for their support. And this was disingenuous completely in his loyalty to his nominal patrons, the monarchy of Spain, and provides clear insights as to why all the contemporaries of Christopher Columbus despised it. Now, Columbus, of course, was rewarded catastrophically for his duplicitous loyalties by the Commission Command over no less than 4 expeditionary crusades. These were, in reality, Jewish holocausts to the New World. Now, this was motivated by Her Royal Highness's desire to have him fall off the edge of the earth, to employ a play on the historical mythos of the time. It was a running joke. Nobody believed the earth was flat or that it had an edge. The initial crusade, of course, exposed several important factors about the motivations of Columbus, which was to kill everybody in the New World and repopulate it with Jews to create a Jewish empire. This was proto-Zionism. So we have a situation in which Columbus first ran into the Taino Indians of the Caribbean and the Kerouac, and he annihilated them to the point where we have no physical remnants left of these people. The only words left we have are hammock and hurricane as a heritage from these people. 250,000 came out to greet Columbus, give him gifts of gold that they were dripping in. They wore no other clothing. All they wore was jewelry. The man who knew about this and wrote about this was later sainted by the Roman Catholic Church because he was beheaded by the British Protestants, and that was Sir Thomas More. And Sir Thomas More wrote the book Utopia, which he places in the Western Hemisphere as America. And he said, there the people know no want. And that is how he knew from other sailors who had been there before Columbus of the Taino Indians and of the Indian Utopia, where these people literally lived off fruit that fell from the trees. The weather was always warm. They never needed clothing. They were so peaceful they had never developed weapons. The moment Columbus came out, he was swinging his sword, and he lopped off hands and heads. And he said the Indians were so ignorant of war, they held their hands and heads out because they had no idea my blade could cut them. And he killed dozens of them on the spot and found it so enjoyable he never stopped. By the time that Columbus conducted all the crusades, which wiped out all the native populations of the Caribbean, it is estimated that they were killing about 2 people a minute, or further than that, every few seconds in the Caribbean, he and his men. And they never stopped killing. They would line them up on meat hooks and see how many one sword could go through at once. They brought in special species of dogs, canary pit bulls, that were bred in the Canary Islands. That's where you get the term canary pit. The Canary Islands belong to Spain to this day. These pit bulls were raised on human flesh. They ate nothing but Indian babies and people. And they were raised on a steady diet of human flesh, which even Columbus and his own men began to eat. This was described by the Roman Catholic priest who protested against all of these atrocities because Columbus and his men didn't consider these people to be people. They ate them as a food. All of this was brought to the attention of the nobility, which ultimately arrested Columbus, but he was bailed out by his Jewish backers and sent back to America to kill more people. This is the Jewish Holocaust in North America, which led to the creation of a Jewish empire called the United States.
Wow.
This is Zionism. And if people don't understand the roots of this, here's how it's impacted you. He killed so many people and spread so much disease because the Europeans were filthy. They never bathed. The Indians were entirely hygienic. The Aztec people bathed. Everybody in North America who was native or indigenous bathed. The Europeans never bathed because the climate was too cold and they would catch pneumonia. So they brought the filth of disease that wiped out tens of millions of more Indians ahead of them. By the end of this Holocaust, of which there's never truly been an end, we still have persecution of indigenous peoples in Latin American nations, from Brazil through Ecuador into Patagonia, where Native American peoples are still dying. So this is a Holocaust that has never ended, started by this Jewish fiend. And this individual, even in his own time, within his lifetime, wound up launching a Holocaust so large that within a single century, and then maybe a little beyond that, 100 million people died. At this point in history, we calculate about 127 million people from the Falkland Islands in Patagonia all the way up to Nunavut or Antarctica, that region in the polar regions near the North Pole. From all the way up there with the Inuits, what are known as Eskimos to many American people, the native indigenous peoples of the polar regions, all the way down through North America into the Caribbean and Mesoamerica and Latin America, all the way down south. Over 127 million people died, mostly within the century of Christopher Columbus. The results were beyond catastrophic because these people were farmers. What most people have is, of course, a myth or an ignorant impression of the Native Americans as hunter-gatherers. These are the High Plains Indians who followed the buffalo herds. They had an entire lifestyle based on this relationship with the buffalo herds that was destroyed by the white man, but the majority of Indians were farmers, including many in the Southwest, like the Hopi. These farmers, such as the original Anasazi of the Southwest American regions of the Southwest of the United States, who fought off the Aztec Empire, were farmers, as was the Aztec Empire itself. So when all these people died and there was no one left to farm or till arable land, we had reforestation. Of reforestation within a century after Columbus. This changed the carbon dioxide levels of planet Earth and generated what became known as the mini ice age. Within a century and a little more, about a century and a half, by the 1800s, we had people ice skating across the Thames River over which London is built. And these people were ice skating across that Thames River, and glaciers were advancing so fast in Europe. In Switzerland, one glacier was so aggressive, people assumed it was inhabited by a demon, and they called in priests to perform an exorcism on the glacier. This is how fast glaciers were advancing in Europe at that time. Greenland, discovered by the Vikings, became covered in ice. It is now the only continent, it's properly a continent, not the world's largest island, it's properly a continent, very similar to Antarctica. It is the only continent in the world covered in ice sheet along with Antarctica because of that ice age. We are still facing the repercussions climatologically because with the extermination of the Indians, the Americans of both Americas, North and South America, began to import slaves from Africa. And when they began to import these slaves from Africa by the millions, and of course, ultimately, at the very most conservative estimates, 20 million of them died en route to the United States or Central America or Latin America alone. That means just crossing the Atlantic, 20 million of them died. Many more died once they were in South America, the Brazilian region, or in the southern areas of the United States. And of course, slavery was legal all over the United States, predominantly demographically in the South, because, of course, the very thing that the slaves could work with was the heat that the white man could not withstand from working in the field. And of course, they were a high-priced commodity for that, as they were all over Brazil, etc. All of these slaves who died under chattel slavery, we come up to a number that is similar to 100 million people. So you have 200 million people who died with the advent of Columbus, and with all those black slaves that died out of West Africa, there were no farmers left to farm their agricultural-based empires in Africa. With the collapse of those empires, Africa had tremendous reforestation. That's what generated all of the carbon dioxide changes in the atmosphere that led to the Ice Age, which still covers Greenland, where an enormous amount of petroleum reserves could be reached if they were not covered in this terrible ice sheet. All because of this one Jewish fanatic making a home for his empire of Jewish people. Nothing can match that.
Right.
That atrocity is literally inconceivable, so inconceivable it's not taught to you in your history books.
Not at all.
But it gets worse. And then, of course, we have the advent of another Jewish individual by the name of Karl Marx. By the way, the term rabbi is also a name. It's not just a position. And, of course, his original name was Rabbi Moshe. And Karl Marx was, of course, ethnically Jewish. By nationality, he was born in Prussia, so he was actually a German national. He moved to Britain, where, of course, he was sponsored. And, of course, he concocted the ideology that would later be responsible for communism. This communism would spread all over the world on the backs and in the minds and on the lips and at the hands of Jewish intellectuals. That's why it became known as Judeo-Bolshevism. A Jew by the name of Bela Kun took over Bulgaria and began one of the major genocides in European history. Many Jewish people were responsible for atrocities and revolutions throughout Europe on the basis of this new godless ideology, and the end result, when it moved all the way from Russia into my own nation of China, into Southeast Asia with the conquest of Vietnam, ultimately, we still have today, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, more people still living in the languishing under the one-party state system of communism than we have that live in democracy. It's important to remember when the two Vietnams united under communism, they became the third largest communist nation on earth. The largest in population was China, the second largest was the Soviet Union, and the third largest was Vietnam. It fielded the third largest army in the world at that time, and it had a population of 78 million people. It has about 80 million today. It had a population about 75 million at that time, about 80 million today. And the only reason it hasn't grown more radically is because the enormous number of purges and, of course, deaths under communism that have taken place in United Vietnam. And, of course, under Mao Zedong, well over 100 million people died in his regime. My nation, the nationalist Chinese, which relocated to Taiwan, fought against the communists. That civil war against the communists was so brutal that more Chinese died in the nationalist communist Chinese civil war on mainland China than Chinese were killed by the Japanese in World War II. And the Japanese in World War II killed 100 million Chinese. So we had another 200 million Chinese that died in that civil war and under Maoist regime thereafter as established in China, then died in the Second World War. We have, of course, all the deaths that took place under Joseph Stalin that resulted in 100 million deaths. We have all that took place in Vietnam combined with communist regimes in Cuba and that still stand in China, Cuba, Vietnam. These communist regimes that have existed and perpetrated these atrocities have produced a veritable superpower of the dead, something that is equal to hundreds of millions of people that have died because of the godless philosophy of this Jewish pseudo-intellectual Karl Marx. And so this incredible disaster brought upon all humanity, hundreds of millions of deaths, is compounded by the Second World War itself, because many of the Bolshevik commissars were indeed ethnically Jewish, because Joseph Stalin supported the Jewish people in his attempt to create a Jewish Soviet He was responsible for the great genocide against the Germans after the Second World War. This is another aspect of Judaism people are entirely unaware of. The Sephardim, which are the original Semitic Jewish peoples that were in southeastern Europe, began to migrate out of Western Europe because many of those stuck in southeastern Europe would die in the Balkans. They would be massacred by the Bosnian Muslims and other groups affiliated with the Schutzstaffel. But many of those in Western Europe who saw the advent of the failed Reich as a threat began to be forced to leave at the time that the Jews declared war on Germany. Now, whoever doubts this, just look up the headlines. Judea declares war on Germany. The attempt was by the Jewish diaspora in Britain, the United States, and the Western world to delegitimate Adolf Hitler as soon as he was elected. And it's very important to remember that Adolf Hitler was elected. He stepped into power in 1933 only in the sense of coalition power. He was basically an administrator of a democracy. Weimar Germany elected him in a coalition government with the conservatives. So Adolf Hitler was in charge of a democratic Germany, not in charge of a Reich. It became a Reich in response to the Jewish declaration of war. As soon as he became Reichskanzler, or the Chancellor of the Democracy of Germany, the Jewish diaspora declared war on Germany with sanctions and economically was trying to sponsor war by other states against Germany. And this resulted, of course, in his response of anti-Jewish pogroms. But in the meantime, he tried to maintain enough diplomatic contact with the Jewish people to create a state for them in Palestine. He organized what was called Halavara, or the transfer agreement. And the transfer agreement enabled Jewish people to move from Germany and take their money with them. This was at a time when Germany desperately needed money for rehabilitation of its economy. He made this exception for Jews because he was, to put it bluntly, that nice a guy. And because he helped the Jews to leave and organize, he wanted to relocate the Jews anywhere in the world. Madagascar was a proper name, Melanesia was a potential target. Uganda was another place that was considered, a former German colony bordering Kenya. We have all of these areas, but the Jews insisted on Palestine. And because of that, he was trapped in terms of sanctions that were crippling him, an attempt to get the Jews out of Germany peacefully into Palestine. And the founding father of Israel at that point was Adolf Hitler. So when the Jews speak of Havara, which they speak of it not at all, which simply means like moving house in the Hebrew, an individual who was of Jewish descent himself, I believe his name was Joseph Black, wrote a book called The Transfer Agreement. He suffered death threats. He suffered attempts to discredit him, but no one could disprove his historical veracity and the reality of what he said. The transfer agreement was quite real. It had an enormous impact on the world, far more than people realize. At the absolute minimum, 100,000 Jews were relocated to Palestine, and Adolf Hitler became the father of Jewish Palestine. Now, all of this is hidden from the Jews themselves. Just as you have Golda Meir, who said to the Jewish students in schools when she visited, there's no such thing as Palestinians. Palestinians never existed. And this is the woman who was, of course, the emissary between Israel and the rest of the world. Now, everyone knows better, but the Americans believe it and say, oh, yes, it was just an empty land, a strip of desert inhabited by lizard people until the Jews came back and made it this great nation that it is. That's how stupid Americans are. So you've got this whole situation now that after Adolf Hitler, the biggest supporter of the Jews who picked up was Joseph Stalin. And he had all of these Jewish commissars, and these Bolsheviks literally were running the Gulag system, the Gulagari of the Soviet Union. And of course, when they conquered Eastern Europe, they hijacked and took over the administration of the Totenslagen, or the death camps, and converted them to death camps for Germans under Jewish administration. The Jews killed an incredible number of Germans. Let me put this into some perspective for you. Before World War II, the population of Germans all over Europe, those that were in the Sudetenland, those that were in the Ukraine, those that were in the Volga, all deported by Stalin, etc., all of these Germans comprised 180 million Germanic peoples. You had 180 million Germanic peoples. Today, if you were to put the populations of East and West Germany together, which they are united with Austria, then you would have about 100 million German peoples. About 100 million Germans. What happened to 80 million Germans? 80 million Germans were annihilated by the Jewish peoples.
Exactly.
In these concentration camps. And of course, this is part of that mass killing that again adds to this death toll of hundreds of millions from the American Holocaust, to the Holocaust of communism, to the post-war Holocaust in Europe of the Germanic peoples. The Jewish peoples are responsible for more death and misery than any other group of people on earth. And we're talking about a population in Israel of 5 million. Now, all of those people in Israel are not responsible for all of this death and dying worldwide. Their culture is. The culture, of course, has become identified with this state of Israel. But what we want to do is escape using buzzwords such as Hizar or Zionist or Rothschild simply to inculcate a Judeophobia without understanding that there are Jewish people who themselves find revulsion with this.
Exactly.
There are, of course, Jewish people who are not communists. There are Jewish people who are not Zionists. There are Jewish people who are not basically promoting some kind of militant fascism in the name of expansion. There are Jewish people who are entirely ashamed of what Christopher Columbus did. It has to be remembered that this is a population in which there is an enormous amount of conflict within that population, as small as it is. And were that population to disappear in Israel, the reality is that the Jewish culture would probably disappear, because it would probably breed out of existence within a very short period of time. It probably would lack the cultural coherency at this point in history to maintain itself in identity. It doesn't matter that it did so for thousands of years. It probably could not survive the disappearance of the state of Israel. So that's something that does need to be taken into account. However, Palestine needs to be, to an extent, united. It needs to be given an outlet to the sea. The geography of Israel definitively has to change. Israelis do need to be removed as a population base in the majority from many cities in what is today Israel. And because of that, what we are going to have is a situation in which there's going to be a lot of dislocation if there is rehabilitation to the state of Israel into something that is not a racist, apartheid, communistic, fascist, white settler regime as extant on the Levantine today in occupied Palestine. But the removal of all Jews from the state of Israel would be, I think, basically asking too much. There are people who have been born there at this point. It's very similar to the South African situation, where the Boer trekkers are the original Boer peoples of the Dutch ancestry who populated southern Africa centuries ago at this point, well over a century ago, are as much African as any other blacks in Africa. They are essentially a white tribe of Africa at this point. The displacement of them out of Africa since the collapse of apartheid has been violent, and they have suffered a form of genocide with the collapse of the apartheid regime. There's no argument with that. Something similar could happen in Israel, and the best thing to do is, of course, change the form of government that they have. And the form of government that they have, of course, is what Americans consider to be a democracy. The form of government that they have is, of course, a democracy so long as you're ethnically Ashkenazim in particular are considered to be Jewish, etc., whereas they maintain a separate state system for Palestinians or people not of their ethnos. This is entirely racist, but of course Americans accept that because they feel these are the chosen people, and therefore they should be allowed to get away with whatever they want to get away with. The Americans would give them their firstborn sons and daughters to rape gladly. So we are dealing with the pathology of the only reason that Israel exists is because of American backing. Now, none of this had to be this way. When it came to the reign of Joseph Stalin was trying to establish a Jewish people's collective communist republic in the state of Israel in Palestine. So he began to ship over many Russian Jews with combat experience from the Second World War who had served as Bolsheviks, commissars, and these political cadres began to organize Palestine along collectivist communist lines. That's why they began to start the kibbutz system. The kibbutz system is a collective system. It's a system of communist collectives that are known as communes. That's what a kibbutz is. It's a commune. And so all of this began to expand, ultimately, ironically enough, with American capitalist help, when Stalin was backing them up. And at that period of time, after the age of Hitler and the European continent, while Germans were being annihilated, and they were bringing these Jews over from Eastern Europe over to Palestine, Stalin began to intensely mistrust the Jews. He felt they were backstabbing him, that they were using him, and that's because the majority of these communist Jews, with the recognition, he wanted to give them legal recognition by the United Nations, in order to preempt him and to win the Jewish vote that would carry him into a second presidency. Harry Truman, who otherwise in his private diaries and in public referred to Jews as kikes and every other expletive you can imagine, here's this racist Klansman. And this racist Klansman, actual member of the KKK, Harry Truman, decides he's going to recognize Israel first so he can be voted into presidency for a first term. It's important to remember he was never elected. He became president after Roosevelt died.
Right.
So after Roosevelt died and Harry Truman became president, he was seeking a second term. And so when he sought this second term, he basically turned to the Jewish lobby and said, hey, can you get me votes if I recognize Israel? And of course, the Jewish lobby was predominantly communist. The people who held the big victory parade when Israel was recognized by Harry Truman were the Communist Red Front in the United States and the communist leaders of the Jewish community. This was looked at as a tremendous communist victory. So here's Harry Truman supporting a communist state that was collective, and Haifa, where many of the Israelis were deporting at the time, immigrating into Israel through, was known as Red Haifa. It was collective. And many radicalized communist Israelis were in the northern regions waiting to meet up with the Soviet army, just like the Allies had done on the Rhine. And all of these Israelis were ready to go to war against the United States on the orders of Joseph Stalin. The irony of it all was that the moment Harry Truman recognized Israel, Stalin felt ripped off and he no longer trusted the Jews because they let Harry Truman recognize them first. He got in there with sloppy seconds hours later and said, they really screwed me and they really want capitalism and they're all a bunch of rich capitalists anyway, so F them. So that's when Joseph Stalin began to turn against the Jewish people and they became an American burden. All thanks to Harry Truman, because no one in the United Nations wanted an apartheid state of Israel. People were looking for a Palestine in which there was a Jewish community, a Jewish presence, that it would be integrated with the Palestinian community side by side, that the Semites and the Judaic peoples, the emigres from Europe, would live peacefully. But no, Stalin and Harry Truman became Zionists. And they said, we want a ethnically pure, racial Jewish state of Turkic apartheid mongers. And that's apartheid is the Dutch word for apartheid.
Right.
And that's when they began ethnically cleansing the Palestinians in Al-Nakba, the great catastrophe where 1 million people died during dislocation. So you have a culture based on genocide, all on the foundation of Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, and Harry Truman. And these three forefathers of Israel created the monstrosity we have today. And of course, the Israelis wound up turning against the Americans, as of course everyone knew they would, because they were basically people who had utter contempt for everyone who was helping them, because they felt everyone who was helping them was stupid, was ignorant, was unable to see through their mask, and they have a total contempt for that which they parasitize. And it is a parasitization. Israel is a parasite state. So we have this situation in which, with all this support they were getting, they weren't getting it soon enough. They ran into Dwight D. Eisenhower at first, and that was when the American Allied system fell apart. That's when the Allies collapsed. At that point in time, because of the establishment of the State of Israel and all of the war they were making against their Arab neighbors, who were flooded with the deported emigres that were coming out of Israel to escape genocide, the Arab nations went to war against Israel. And Israel, of course, invaded Egypt and wanted to occupy the Suez Canal so they could control all access from the Mediterranean into the Indian Ocean and control all trade in the world by conquering the Suez Canal and keeping Europe and Asia forever separated, where they would be the tithe collector and the highwayman. Now, of course, the British were willing to aid them in this. The French came to their aid to maintain colonialism in Algeria. So the British and the French and the Israelis were fighting the Arabs. And Russia, of course, stood back in splendid isolation, saying, look at the animals dance. And America was called in, and at that point in history, Dwight D. Eisenhower was going to side against the Jews. He said, I want every, this is an actual quote, Eisenhower said, I want every Jew in the United States to start thinking like an American instead of a Jew. Can you imagine anyone saying that in this day and age? No one would ever dare to say that. And he sent the U.S. Navy into the Mediterranean, and he was prepared to go to war against Israel, against the Brits, and against the French. That was the collapse of the entire Allied front, right then and there, is that America was going to take on her wartime Western allies and the Jews. And that was far worse than anything that happened with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't jack shit compared to that, but you never hear of it. That was the Suez Canal crisis. People can read the book Warriors at the Suez to really get a hold of the politics at that time. That book, Warriors at the Suez, describes exactly what was going on and how lunatic the behavior of the Jews in Israel was at that time, where they were waging war against everyone around them and drawing the world into a global conflict with impunity. And of course, it just got worse. Basically, it got to the position where, of course, America became very dependent on petroleum. And of course, America had been dependent on the Bretton Woods monetary system agreement that was established by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, this is something people need to be educated in, because they have absolutely no concept of this or what's going on in the world. Americans will listen to all kinds of propagandists who tell them, oh, Nixon took us off the gold standard. Nothing could be further from the truth. Right. That is a lie. If anyone tells you Nixon took us off the gold standard, they are lying through their teeth. Turn around and walk away. They have nothing to say that you can believe. They are shills and propagandists. The person who took the United States off the gold standard was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He did it as soon as he was in power. He ascended to power the same year as Adolf Hitler in 1933. He instantly established a dictatorship. He would rule until the day he died. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt demanded all Americans turn in their gold. So all Americans, like idiots, gave up life savings that would have sent all their children to college. The overwhelming majority of all of you Americans today would not be living in trailer parks. You'd be living in actual homes that you owned. You'd not be renting. You wouldn't be living in Rust Belt. You'd actually be living fat if it weren't for Franklin Delano Roosevelt and your stupid, stupid parents and grandparents, rather, or great-grandparents, who gave him all their gold that Americans had been saving up for generations. So all this gold was turned into the U.S. government. It was all stolen by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And, of course, he printed the money without backings of gold. That was the difference between the United States dollar and the Axis powers. The United States dollar was a fiat currency. He said, I'm going to take it off the gold standard, and it won't be backed by anything, and we can print ourselves out of the depression. So I can print as much as I want because it's not tied down to any reserves. So he began to print the United States dollar. And because it was a fiat currency, because it was play money, anybody could use it as an exchange currency. And because of that, all of the allied nations he could pressure, all the great empires, the British Empire, the Dutch Empire, the French Empire, all of the Western nations that in the main, and many of the other nations he could pressure in Latin America, all went off the gold standard, and they pegged all their currencies to the United States dollar as the reserve currency of the world. So the United States dollar became the reserve currency of the world because it could be freely exchanged, used for exchange purposes because it wasn't tied down to any reserves. It became the most fluid currency on earth. And at that point, the Axis said no. Japan, Germany, Italy, all of their satellite nation-state allies. Japan was allied with Manchukuo and Manchukuo, or Manchukuo, was known, of course, to the Americans as Manchuria. And the Manchukuo Imperium was where, of course, Emperor Puyi, formerly Emperor of China, was of Qing ethnicity, meaning he was Manchurian, reestablished himself in an alliance with Japan. The Japanese also had allies in the Chinese Imperial Republic in terms of Emperor Yuan Shikai, who was a warlord who had declared himself emperor. The Japanese were allied with Bao Dai, the Emperor of Vietnam. They were allied with the King of Thailand. All the kings of the East united with Japan in saying we want to maintain the gold standard. Then, as well, of course, the Axis satellite miners, Finland, Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia, all of these satellite states of Europe united with the German-dominated exchange rate system to maintain gold as their standardized backing for their currencies. This is what created World War II. The combined axis of nations maintained a gold standard, whereas the Americans wanted everybody using this paper play money, the United States dollar. This is what led to the Second World War. Now, all of this was going on while the transfer agreement was going down. Now, Adolf Hitler began to get aggressive and impatient after a while when the Jewish lobbies began to successfully sanction him and maintain a cordon of nations around him, turning many nations, such as Britain and France, against him. He began to deport Jews or ask that they leave no matter where they went. The Japanese took in an enormous amount of them. Sephardim Jews. These were real Jews. The Sephardim Jews, the ethnically Semitic, real Jews, went to Japan, where they were relocated in Manchukuo, in the Manchurian Imperium, in what today is known as the Jewish Autonomous Oblast of Russia. This is known by its capital of Birobidzhan. Birobidzhan is the capital of the Jewish Autonomous Region of Russia, which borders between Siberia and northern China in what was the Manchurian Imperium. You can look this up on the map. It is still there today. There are a couple 100,000 Jews that live there, real Jews, Sephardim, who speak Yiddish, the national language, unlike the posers or the impostoring Turkic peoples who call themselves Israeli, who speak Hebrew, so they can get all the Americans believing they're of the Bible and the people of the book and the people of God. The real Jews were speaking the Eastern European language of Yiddish. The national language of the Jewish Autonomous Oblast of Russia is Yiddish. This nation was created by the Japanese. It was invaded and conquered by Stalin at the end of proactive prosecution of hostilities in the Asia-Pacific region in 1945. Birobidzhan is the capital of this Jewish Autonomous Oblast, originally the name for the entire nation state, when the Japanese were bringing in many of these Sephardim immigrants, they ultimately imported 1 million Jews. 1 million Jews were there at the height of that national foundation. What is now simply a satrap or a buffer state that is an autonomous region of Russia was an independent nation state of 1 million Yiddish-speaking Sephardim Semitic Jews. These were, of course, helped to relocate by Sassoon, who was known as a Baghdadi Jew. These were Jews from Southwest Asia or the Middle East, today's Syria, Iraq region. Sassoon was, of course, someone who is of Vidal Sassoon cosmetology fame. We had other such Sassoons who were involved with the Hong Kong exchange rate system in the stock markets of Hong Kong. And so when FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, started World War II, and he did start it, one of the factors by which he started it, aside from cutting off Japanese oil, was by freezing all Japanese accounts. And of course, he froze all trade and cut off all Chinese accounts. He froze all Chinese assets as well as Japanese assets so that Japan couldn't reach to the outside world through the Sephardim Jewish-dominated Hong Kong stock market. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt, with a single stroke of a pen, by freezing all Japanese assets and Chinese assets, sentenced hundreds of millions of Chinese to starvation, which is why China declared war on the United States along with Japan, and Americans don't know this. China declared war on the United States along with Japan, as did all the kings of the East, Vietnam, Manchuria, Thailand, etc., declared war on America along with Emperor Hirohito, because he sentenced everyone to death by cutting off the monetary outreach to the world of Japan and China. And so at war with all of Asia. And over there at that time were many of these Jewish emigres. Ultimately, many of them would leave that region of Siberia when the nation state of Israel was founded. Not many of them would necessarily go to Israel. Many of them relocated to the United States. But ultimately, the true Israel for Sephardim Jewish peoples had America not launched the Second World War. It felt that these Jewish people, of course, were a threat to the United States because, of course, the Japanese and the Chinese had no way of infiltrating the United States. There was no way they could sell in the U.S. market. Japanese and Chinese salesmen couldn't come to the United States and invade its market. They had no ability to penetrate the American economy, but the Jews could. The Jews look like white people.
Right.
So since these Sephardim Jews were considered such a threat to the United States, the Secretary of the Treasury of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was himself Jewish, insisted on restricting all immigration into the United States of Jews. This is why so many of them died during the Holocaust in Europe. They weren't allowed to come to the United States based on the threat of those coming from the Asian mainland of Japan and its holdings in Manchuria. So this resulted in multiple Jewish deaths. This resulted in, of course, the incredible Second World War and all of the destruction caused by that. America was no longer on the gold standard, but the world was stuck on the United States dollar as the reserve currency of the world. And he basically broke the back of the United States. Before the Second World War, the United States was the Saudi Arabia of the world. All of the world's petroleum came from the United States. Sweet, light crude would just float to the top of the ground. And during World War II, he had to supply everyone who was an ally. Because the Soviet Union, it didn't matter, it had enormous natural gas deposits, it couldn't access them. It didn't matter that the British had oil in the North Sea, they had no technology with which to even discover such. It doesn't matter who had what, nobody was able to reach it during wartime. So every single drop of oil that was used to build, say for instance, the China-Burma-India theater roadway, this entire paved road going ultimately from India into China through Burma. This entire roadway, the Ledo Road, the Burma Road, this whole network of roads was built with American concrete using American trucks American concrete mixers. Every single nail that went into every single telephone pole that wired every single foot of those roads was made in America. Every single ounce of labor came from America. Black engineer battalions. Every single drop of oil to make that came from the United States. The United States had to supply the oil for all the Soviet Union, all of its Chinese allies, all of the French Empire, and all the British Empire, which of course ruled India and therefore had rule over 1 billion people. So it's providing the 1 billion people in China with oil. The United States provided the 1 billion people of India with oil. The United States provided all of Europe and the Soviet Union with oil. The end result was the United States used up 90 billion barrels of oil in World War II within this short, enormous orgasm of waste. For free, without charging a penny, Franklin Delano Roosevelt gave every single drop of oil America had that floated to the surface of the earth, except for that which is in Texas. So he was approached by his geophysicists and engineers, men who would later come up with the term Hubbard's Peak. And they told him, Mr. President, by the year 1975, the United States is going to reach a peak of its easily accessible sweet light crude that bubbles to the surface of the earth, and the United States of America is going to collapse. Our industries will collapse, our economy will collapse, all because of you. And we'll be stuck with dirty shale oil, which takes fresh, sweet, light crude to make. You have to use sweet oil to get shale oil because you have to process all that dirty oil into utilizable oil. So we're going to be using Texas oil to take oil from out of Canada and North Dakota and all these regions, and that'll take up what little oil we have left.
Right.
And so what Franklin Delano Roosevelt said is, I'll surrender to the Saudis. So he went over to the king of the House of Saud to buy him out from under the British. And the House of Saud is a bunch of dirty, thieving camel jockeys that were the most hated tribe of camel thieves in all of Southwest Asia on the Arabian Peninsula. What happened was the British, of course, just to compare this so people understand it in American terms, in the Old West, a man's horse was his only ability to survive. This is why cowboys had a life or death relationship with their horses. If their horse was stolen, they more than likely wouldn't survive the desert, the plains, or any region they were in. The Indians would get them. They would die of dehydration. They would die of starvation before they could reach anywhere where they could access supplies. So a horse was the only thing keeping a man from the grave, from death, from his bones bleaching in the frontier. That's why stealing a horse was considered the filthiest, dirtiest, lowest thing a man could do. This is why horse thieves were immediately hung without trial. So that law still holds in Texas today, where if you steal a car, theoretically it's similar to stealing a man's horse. Theoretically, you could shoot a man for that. So there is still these legal gray areas based on this frontier history. That's what a camel is for a man in the desert. So when you take this tribe of horse thieves, the House of Saud, they were approached by the British, who said, we'll make you the kings of the House of Saud, of the Arabian Peninsula, if you help us fight the actual rulers who protect the most holy sites of Islam, al-Makka and al-Madinah, the Hashimi dynasty. The Hashimi dynasty was the dynasty which gave birth to the Prophet Muhammad himself, peace be upon him, and the Hashimi dynasty is now the kings of the House of Jordan. They weren't always landlocked in this tight little arid piece of desert that is behind the coastline cut off by Israel. The House of Jordan once ruled all of Syria and all of Saudi Arabia. And that Hashimi dynasty was warred against by the British using this dirty tribe of camel thieves that they backed up with machine guns and Gatling guns and air power and bombardment and chemical weapons. And then the House of Saud was installed as guardians over the most holy sites of all Islam, al-Makka and al-Madinah. So now that they were installed, nobody liked them. Everybody hated them because of what they were and who backed them. And therefore, they were totally dependent on the British. So Roosevelt went to buy them out from under the British. And he met with the king of the House of Saud right after Yalta in 1945 in the Great Bitter Lake, very appropriately named, between the locks of the Suez Canal. And the king of the House of Saud knew he had Roosevelt by the balls. Now, in Arabia, in Arabic culture, the greatest insult to any man is to tell him to go F sheep and go play with the sheep herds, and to bring a sheep onto another Arab's dhow or his ship would be an insult that would lead to war among the tribes. So what the king of the House of Saud did was he brought onto the USS Quincy, the presidential flagship, because Roosevelt was on it. They even converted one of its smokestacks into a wheelchair elevator for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So this is the flagship of the United States. So the flagship of the United States was invaded by the House of Saud and its sheep. The king of the House of Saud brought a whole flock of sheep onto the USS Quincy, and he said, Mr. President, these sheep are for your men to have sex with, so they do not violate our pure Muslim women. Whoa. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, my men will have sex with your sheep. And he said, are you my slave? And Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, my people are your slaves. And at that point, they pegged the US dollar to the outflow of Saudi oil and created the petrobuck.
Right.
And the petrobuck made all of you slaves to the House of Saud. So here's the House of Saud in a kind of alliance with Israel, and these two parasites control all of your American empire. And of course, there were times when they went to war. Now, one of those times was during the administration of President Richard Mulhouse Nixon. And Richard Mulhouse Nixon said, I want to regain American sovereignty. So Richard Mulhouse Nixon said, I'm taking America off the American Bretton Woods monetary system, in which all of the world's money is pegged to the US dollar, and the US dollar itself is pegged to the outflow of Saudi oil, because that enslaves all the world to the outflow of Saudi oil. Now, at this time, he had this horrible man behind him who was Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger was an avowed Zionist. Henry Kissinger was ethnically Jewish, but he was more than that. He was a Zionist. And Henry Kissinger was in charge of the State Department, which means he effectively ran the American empire, whereas President Nixon ran the American United States. And so you had this horrible situation in which, after Nixon took America off the Bretton Woods monetary system, then what happened was the House of Saud retaliated, as did OPEC, the oil-producing exportation cartel. The primary member state, the first member state of OPEC, by the way, was Venezuela. It was not any of the Arab nations. Originally, it was Venezuela. And so Venezuela and the OPEC, of course, all part of that oil petroleum exportation cartel, the oil bloc, they found themselves at war with Israel. And Israel was involved in what they call the Yom Kippur War. This is known as the Ramadan War to the Arab peoples. And during the 7-day war, you had the downfall of the Nixon administration. And the Saudis struck back with a character assassination. They started Watergate. And of course, any analysis of Watergate today looks utterly ridiculous. Oh, he was stealing some information from the Democratic office. Who cares? It is so meaningless. It is so trivial in light of today's scandals that no one can believe in today's generation that it made the news. But the Watergate scandal destroyed Richard Nixon, and he had a choice of impeachment or resignation. By the way, he was never impeached. He resigned. Right. And President Clinton, on the other hand, was indeed impeached, but stayed in power.
But stayed in office, yeah.
Yeah, stayed in office. So here's Nixon. He resigned, and at that point, who was running the American empire? Henry Kissinger. And Henry Kissinger, 100%, balls to the wall, took America to near war with the Soviet Union to back up Israel. He was given the Presidential Medal of Honor of Israel. He was given the Israeli version of the Congressional Medal of Honor for forcing all of America into war 100% behind Israel, because Israel would have died. Israel would have disappeared with Soviet support behind the Arabs. And the entire world, Europe and Asia and the Soviet Union, all backed the Arabs. But Kissinger ran the United States and the American empire while Nixon was on the ropes, and he backed up Israel, and Israel is still around today, whereas otherwise it would have perished and we wouldn't be having this discussion. And for that, he was given the Israeli version of the Congressional Medal of Honor. So he wasn't even serving the United States. He was serving Israel. And here's this war criminal, this incredibly evil Zionist, who ran American empire while the American president was run out of office by the Arabs of the House of Saud. And what happened was that, of course, they brought in Henry Ford very shortly thereafter, who had the decency to pardon Richard Nixon, understanding what was going on. And of course, we had a situation where at that point, America was forever slave circuited to Israel. And Israel was like a minnow in the Mediterranean that was dragging a whale in its wake with a fishing hook. And that is the American foreign policy since that point in time, slave circuited to Israel, 100%, and the House of Saud, both. Because, of course, the Arabs, OPEC, struck back with a oil embargo that broke the American economy. The U.S. dollar collapsed. People don't remember this. The U.S. dollar collapsed. Think about what I'm saying. The U.S. dollar collapsed. People don't get this.
Right.
And at that point, the American economy never recovered. The
Right.
British economy never recovered. Asia recovered, but the British economy never did. The European economy ultimately recovered to an extent, but Britain and America remained in depression. Britain withdrew from that point forward to west of the Suez Canal for generations until Operation Desert Shield and Operation Desert Storm. And as for North America, their man, Richard Mulhouse Nixon, who had created the space shuttle program. Richard Mulhouse Nixon created the space shuttle program, and that was our space program until the last space shuttle fell apart. So once Nixon was taken out of office, the entire American space program died. Without Richard Mulhouse Nixon, no other president ever invested in anything near the space shuttle, and America's space program died. America's military mutinied over in Vietnam. American divisions refused to advance because they had no commander-in-chief, and the man who was running American empire was a foreign Jew, and American units rebelled and mutinied. And so the Vietnam War was lost. The American dollar collapsed. The space program died. All because Americans kicked out Nixon under the behest of the House of Saud and allowed rule by the Jew, Henry Kissinger, for their gods, the people of the state of Israel. See, Americans worship the Jew. And as far as they're concerned, that is who they want as president. There was actually a book written called President Kissinger at that time, which shows Kissinger taking over the world under the rule of communism. I have a copy of that book.
Wow.
That was published at that time as a test run to see if the American people would accept his rule over America and the world. That is how effed up Americans are and how much they worship the Jew. So now we come at this crisis point due to 9/11, due to so much else that has taken place, where Americans are beginning to wake up. And what we want to see is a reformation. What is the solution without going towards a holocaustic final solution of genocide? So I say, of course, it is rehabilitation of the Jewish state system, the changing of its borders and boundaries, and of course, changing it to an entirely different form of government. Now, what I propose is entirely radical and unconventional, but it is based on the diseased mind of the American people and their psychotic anti-culture, which is based on fundamentalist biblical literalism, which miscommunicates the Bible. As I've said, the Bible was not only originally censored by the church, it wound up being translated under the Protestant Revolution and Reformation in England by a king who wanted to create his own church so that he could have divorces. And this king radically translated the Bible into what we know as the King James Bible. This was actually taking place before King Henry VIII, but this was all part of that process of Protestantism and the changes in England that were reforming it ultimately with its break from the European continent and the Roman Catholic Church. But when we had this King James Bible produced, this is, of course, a translation that doesn't necessarily in any way, shape, or form accurately reflect the original Aramaic language or Syriac languages in which the Bible was written by the people who were there. So we've got excisions from the Bible, we've got a Bible that's been translated, And then Americans take this and they take it, quote unquote, literally, they miscommunicate it, and then they develop this ideology of Jews as the holy people, the people of God, and they focus their attention on the wrong people. This is, of course, the synagogue of Satan, America itself, because their synagoguery is based on a miscommunication of the most holy book of the Bible. So to overcome that, Americans need to rehabilitate their consciousness, and they need to be cured of what they're awaiting. What many Americans want is an apocalypse, an Armageddon, in which a king of the Davidian line, Jesus Christ, will return to rule over Israel. They want to rebuild the temple on the mount. They want to breed heifers for sacrifice in the temple. This is why you have people in Texas, ranchers in Texas, who are breeding red heifers for sacrifice in the temple when it's reconstructed.
People don't,
this level,
people don't realize that the Messiah that they're expecting is the Antichrist.
Well, I think that's a favorite American parlor game. The Americans want to identify who is the Antichrist. It's like pin the tail on the donkey. They point to everybody and anybody they can think of, and everybody's got their favorite. And the reality is the Antichrist is the synagogue of Satan, which is the American misinterpretation of Christianity.
Wow.
In a very real sense, there may be a personal Antichrist at some time, but to avoid that personal Antichrist manifesting, we have to destroy the American ability to think that by generating a war, they will bring about the apocalypse, which will bring Christ back. Now, we may be in the end days. We may be in a period of history. Every period of history is the end of the world as we know it in one way or another. This, of course, is the most important point in American and world history. This is the most important point in all human history because of several factors I can't even go into right now, which just take hours and hours to explain. And it's far more demographic than it is something theologic. But the reality is that we are in a time now where Americans need to be brought to the awareness that they can't just make God come back by initiating actions. We have people out there who are trying to force God to return by forcing a war, the rebuilding of a temple. God acts on his own time and at his own behest. The idea that we can force that by supporting Israel and a global war is not only insane, it's sacrilegious, it's heretical, it is blasphemous.
I agree.
And so what needs to happen is conventionally, I would say the most conservative thing we can do is approach the Jews who have the most to lose, the ones everyone blames for the conspiracies. And a great example of that is the Rothschilds dynasty. They have actually condemned many aspects of Zionism. And that's important to note is that the Rothschilds in Israel have a very confrontational history because the Rothschilds, of course, never wanted to leave Europe. Who would want to give up Europe to move to a desert? It doesn't matter that they have ski resorts. It doesn't matter that they have beachfront property. The majority of European people who were Jews were well established and, of course, not going to stand for relocation. Now, despite everything that went on in Europe, the Rothschilds dynasty was able to survive by relocating to Switzerland, the neutral nation, taking the majority of their money with them, of course. They've been somewhat supportive of Israel, but the people in charge of the Rothschilds dynasty have also explained that they are very cynical about Israeli politics and do their best to avoid Israel and everything that it has come to stand for. So with having the most to lose, the other interesting aspect of the Rothschilds is they actually have royal titles that were given to them by the crowns of Europe in both Austria and in Britain. Now, since Brexit and the British have left the continent of Europe, theoretically, and it may take a very long time for any true break between Britain and the European continent, and there's all kinds of, shall we say, problems on the road to that. But basically, one of the things that Britain has is it's got a series of titles which it can use to coronate people with baronies and duchies and various other title systems into kings of other nations. The Rothschild, who is a baron in both Britain and Austria, can be crowned as the monarch of a kingdom of Israel. And the Israel state could be taken away from its present democracy under a fascist communist collective that is dependent on American backing and turned into a British monarchy. And that would mean that as allied with Britain, any attack on the kingdom of Israel under a Rothschild dynasty would be an attack on Britain itself. That would mean it's an attack on NATO and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So the best result of this is that you would have a conservative dynasty with the most to lose that would at least be in charge of Israel and antithetical to the insanities of the nationalism of the present Israeli state based on mob democracy. So that is something that could actually work. And in that name, of course, with a secular king in charge of a earthly kingdom, you would have the Americans no longer able to say Israel doesn't have a king. They would no longer push for an Armageddon in order to bring back a king from the Davidian line. And of course, so too should the House of Saud be overthrown, since it's an American dynasty that is in charge of America by the British, who could reinstate the Hashimi dynasty as the guardians of Al-Makkah and Al-Madinah. That would, of course, lead to the king of the House of Jordan being the representative for Dar al-Islam, or the world of Islam. This would create an incredibly stable world under British coordination that could do so much better than what the Americans did with their evil empire, based on Holocaust from a Jewish Colombian from the very beginning. That is a conservative recommendation on my part towards a solution that is non-genocidal, but will still have displacements of population. Israel needs to be shrunk, become not so small as the Kingdom of Monaco, but certainly a much smaller kingdom, leaner and meaner, without the wall that now separates these people, which brings us, of course, to the horror, which most people are unfamiliar with when I speak of the Israeli wall. Now, it plays a big part in the movie World War Z, or World War Zombie. Now, what I can tell people about is, of course, the reality that I spoke to the zombie phenomenon before anyone brought this up as some kind of speculative phenomenon in their ignorance of the genuine medical conditions behind it. And I could, of course, provide photographic evidence of when I worked in security in the last few years as I was transitioning into becoming a care provider for my parents. I began working security for the hospital systems. I worked private security, Stanford, and it was around 2002 where we were called as a retrieval team with security to bring in someone who was literally a member of the Walking Dead. I have the photographs to prove this. I had put them out there before. They're all over the internet. Most people don't understand the phenomena behind it. And there were only 2 photographs I was able to capture. They were all I needed. They prove irrefutably the condition of the Walking Dead. The dead do walk at times. There's a phenomenon behind this that I knew about because of my years as a Department of Defense research librarian. Now, there are what are called prions. Prion is an acronym for proteinaceous infectious ion. This is a protein that has gone bad, twisted, mutated. It is not a biological organism, but it's very mysterious, and it's something that reproduces in such a way as to continue its existence. And it was irretrievably intertwined between 2 men who were giants in their field. One of them was a physicist named Samuel Cohen, who was Jewish, and the other one was a man named Dr. Stanley Preusner, an MD. I personally met and spoke with. And Dr. Stanley Preusner was the man who isolated the prion, which no one would believe it. Everybody was talking about Alzheimer's disease, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, CJD, mad cow disease, bovine spongiform encephalitis, and transmissible spongiform encephalopathies are known as TSEs. These made a big hit in Britain in terms of their impact on the public when mad cow became a phenomena with British beef, and Americans were coming home with mad cow disease when they had eaten beef in Britain. All of this was a result of cannibalism. In the case of Britain, it came out of India, because India, by United Nations law and international agreement, provides all the skeletons for medical universities and dental universities. So in dental universities and medical universities, they always ask for skeletons of perfectly formed people with perfect teeth. And of course, no one you ever have known in your entire life has ever died with a full set of teeth in their mouth. Everyone you know has at one point or another had their dental infrastructure entirely destroyed and replaced.
Right.
Yes, the idea of finding someone with perfect teeth is impossible, except in India, where you have a population of 1 billion people, and statistically people are so malnourished and they die young that you get people who haven't had time to rot their teeth with various sweets, various other kind of dietary deficiencies that developed nations suffer. So in India, you get these perfect skeletons of all ages that go to medical universities all over the world and dental universities. Children's skulls with full teeth, adult skulls, etc., entire skeletons. They come out of what are called skeleton farms in India, where, of course, many people who died are essentially purged of their flesh and muscle tissue and sold on the market. And, of course, there are rejects, thousands of rejects. What happens to all the rejected skeletons, the imperfect skeletons? They turn them into bone meal. And this human bone meal was fed to British cows because India was once part of the British Empire and is still part of the British Commonwealth. So the Brits began eating cows that had feasted off of dead human bone meal for generations. And this cannibalism resulted in the transmission of PIMPs, prionic isoformulaic microscopic particles. This created a vacuolization of the brain tissues, hence the term spongiform, because the brain turns into a sponge. Through bovine spongiform encephalopathy, BSE, mad cow disease.
Wow.
In humans, it's Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, CJD, or Alzheimer's. Now, what does this have to do with Israel? Everything. Because this man named Samuel Cohen began to work on the neutron bomb in 1958. Now, what was this neutron bomb about? It was based, of course, on Adolf Hitler's military genius and his ability to cannibalize machines. Basically, what a lot of people don't realize is that the German Panzerwaffe, or tank forces in World War II, stole over 16,000 British, Czech, French, Italian, Polish, and Soviet tanks and other armored fighting vehicles from all over the world to feed their war machine. At the height of the Third Reich, tank fleet consisted of 25%, fully a quarter of its Panzerwaffe sourcing from other countries. And the triumph of the Blitzkrieg, 1939 to 1941, resulted in part from this great Panzer cannibalization under the mechanized genius of Adolf Hitler. So to stop another Adolf Hitler from ever advancing forward with armored columns, this Jewish physicist, Samuel Cohen, Stanley Preusner is the name of the man who isolated the prion. Samuel Cohen developed the neutron bomb. And when Samuel Cohen developed the neutron bomb, he made it to generate more radiation than blast, so it would destroy the nervous systems of Panzer crews.
Wow.
Or the tank crews that were running armored columns and mechanized units so that an entire Soviet advance into Eastern Europe could be halted by killing all of the men who drove the tanks, and America could steal all of their tanks and cannibalize them for use in American forces. He created something that would make America be able to do with technology what Adolf Hitler did through his genius. Now, in 1963, President Kennedy agreed to hold an underground test, which was his way of just neutralizing the effects of the neutron bomb. It's a radiation bomb. It's a dirty bomb. The idea of an underground test is absurd. So it's not a blast effect you're getting from the bomb. It's a radioactivity effect. So by doing what he did, Kennedy essentially blitzed the bomb, was saying next to it, saying he didn't approve of it morally, found it reprehensible, and would not support it. Now, of course, people became aware of the zombie concept in 1968 with George Romero's Night of the Living Dead. And, of course, when we had 1969 come around, there was the Sino-Soviet War, which most people in the United States are entirely unfamiliar with. And, of course, we had atomic weapons in the field, nuclear weapons, nuclear warheads deployed operationally in the field by the Soviets to stop the advance of no less than 40 Chinese divisions into Siberia. Nuclear war was conducted at that point, and Americans said, oh, the Chinese are testing nuclear bombs. It was all a cover. Now, by 1971, we had another player in the field, Paweł Sibirski, and he was Polish, and he began to investigate cannibalism in New Guinea and the effects of kuru, which is the laughing disease, where people develop a death-like grin, which they cannot get rid of because they're suffering the mad cow. So this Dr. Paweł Sibirski of the Department of Molecular Pathology and Neuropathology at the Medical University of Łódź in Poland began to research kuru, and he laid the foundations for the research which allowed Dr. Stanley Preussner to isolate the prion based on the research into cannibals in New Guinea. There was a film called Hell of the Living Dead, which was a low-budget Italian film, a spaghetti zombie film, if you will, instead of a spaghetti western, that was made as the prequel to Night of the Living Dead. And Hell of the Living Dead was based off the research of this Polish doctor, or Polski doctor. And they show all of this zombie phenomena starting in New Guinea. And so the doctor, Paweł Sibirski, who made all of this understanding possible, later impacted and influenced Dr. Stanley Preussner, who in 1982 isolated the prion. Now, he was later to win the Nobel Prize in Medicine for that, but that wasn't until 1997. Think about what I'm saying. 1982, he isolated the prion. 1997, he won the Nobel Prize for Medicine in identifying the cause of the cannibal protein that created The Walking Dead. And it took over a decade to give him that Nobel Prize because the results of his research were so horrifying, nobody wanted to recognize them. People don't understand how horrifying his research was because nobody understands prions. You can't kill them except perhaps by disassembling them at the molecular level in a nuclear furnace. Prions are not killed by bleach. They're not killed by solvents. They're not killed by formaldehyde. They survive anything, industrial detergent. And they can survive for thousands of years and be resurrected as if it were yesterday. And they are almost magical. There's no other word for it in that science can't explain them. There are familial cases, which account for 10% of TSEs, or transmissible spongiform encephalopathies, that are passed down through bloodlines that are not yet understood. Inherent traits are genetic, but prions have no DNA. They're proteins. There's a version of this kind of TSE called fatal familial insomnia, FFI. It's a disease found in only a couple dozen bloodlines worldwide.
Wow.
In which the victim can never ever fall asleep, not even when medicated. They can pump them full of opium, Benadryl, any kind of drug you can imagine, and the victim still can't fall asleep. They become delusional, erratic. They linger in a living hell of unending wakefulness until they die of exhaustion and brain damage months and months later. And this is passed down through different generations, where it crops up through this magical protein, which cannot be identified in terms of how it transmits because there's no DNA. So we have this entire phenomenon that for all intents and purposes is supernatural. This is beyond human understanding. That's why it took so long to give Dr. Stanley Proisner the Nobel Prize in medicine. Nobody, literally nobody, would believe what they had discovered. Now, in 1980s is when Reagan came along, who ironically enough suffered Alzheimer's. And Ronald Reagan, of course, suffered Alzheimer's through the majority of his presidency. He spent 18 hours a day sleeping in the White House. He would be brought up like Burgess Meredith. Burgess Meredith also suffered Alzheimer's. Burgess Meredith, in the overwhelming majority of the movies you see Burgess Meredith in, he is totally unaware of what he was doing. His family would bring him on the set. They would give him cue cards to read, and he would read them out as an actor who had been trained all of his life, and they would bring him off the set. He would have no memory of what he did. So if you ever watch Clash of the Titans with Burgess Meredith, he has no understanding of what he's doing and would not remember anything he had done for Clash of the Titans. He's dead now, of course, of Alzheimer's. Nor did he remember what he did in Rocky.
Wow.
So President Reagan was like Burgess Meredith. He was a far better actor as a president than he ever was in the movies. And the man who ran the administration was Bush Sr. So Bush Sr. gave up his second term because he had already run the United States nation into the ground for 3 effing terms. That's why he didn't care about losing that so-called second term.
Right.
He was already in as long as Franklin Delano Roosevelt had been in for president.
Right.
And he was running America while Reagan was in this Alzheimer's torpor. They would bring Reagan up on stage. He would literally say, "I'm going to launch nuclear war." He actually said that on record and on air multiple times. The bombing begins in 5 minutes. He actually said that multiple times. He actually used the term Third World War half a dozen times in just one of his speeches one time when he was referring to the Third World. This man was literally out of his mind. And so you had Bush Sr. run the show while this Alzheimer's-ridden president did, guess what? He gave the go-ahead on the neutron bomb. And so they began to develop in the mid-1980s the neutron inventory of weapons. And the neutron inventory, of course, ultimately had to be destroyed. It's an energy weapon, a radiation bomb. And they developed different types. There was the W-66 warhead, which was an anti-ICBM Sprint missile system. This was produced and deployed in the mid-1970s. It was retired shortly thereafter with the missile system for reasons I'm going to explain. The W-66, of course, was anti-ICBM, anti-ICBOM. That's how the acronym is pronounced in the military vernacular. ICBM, of course, stands for Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. That means that when ICBMs were launched from an enemy nation, the United States could launch this anti-ballistic missile Sprint missile system, the W-66. It would blow up with enough energy impulse, enough of a pulsation to scramble the brains of the incoming warheads, and they would blow up before they reached America. Then they created the W-70 that was used for short-range tactical Lance missiles. And then there was the W-79, the Mod Zero developed for artillery shows. And these artillery shells, ordnance, would of course be used to fire at incoming armored columns and blow away not the columns themselves, but all the personnel inside of them by scrambling their nervous systems instead of their electronic brains. Instead of scrambling missiles, you're scrambling nervous systems and brains. Now, all of these were retired by President George Bush in 1992. It wasn't because it was the end of the Cold War. It's because tests of these missiles produced something horrific. What they produced was something that was known as an ERMI. And an ERMI is, as an acronym goes, I'm trying to remember exactly what it stood for, Enhanced Radioactivated Molecular Ionization Event. So these ERMIs, when they tested this out in front of all the troops, like they did old atomic bomb tests, instantly prionized the soldiers in area, and they created hordes of ravenous zombies.
Oh my God.
That was why the neutron weapons had to be sought down to the last ordnance shell and disassembled.
Wow.
The ultimate one, the fourth type, a strategic variant that was redeployed for scorched earth, is the W-69, and there's only one nation in the world today that maintains them, and that's Israel. Because Dr. Cohen, as a Jew, gave all of the W-69 blueprints to the Israelis. They were originally meant for Air Force deployment, and ultimately hundreds of them wound up in Israel, where they're maintained, produced, reinforced, reassembled to this day. And that's why Israel is the only nation on earth that maintains neutron weapons, which are outlawed by every other nation on earth, including communist China, including Russia. Every other nation on earth outlaws the use of neutron weapons. The only nation on earth that maintains them is Israel. Israel is the only nation on earth that could generate the zombie apocalypse.
This makes perfect sense, because I've always felt that World War Z, basically, because they have that part in the movie where they're in Jerusalem. I always knew there was something that they were trying to tell us in that movie.
That's exactly it. Well, I met the man who wrote the book World War Z, Max Brooks.
I'm sorry.
Personally,
you just blown my mind right now, because it makes complete and total sense what you just said. It just, wow.
Well, Max Brooks, it's important to remember, is Jewish, but that scene in Jerusalem is not in his book. Max Brooks did some ROTC training. He was in Reserve Officer Training Corps, but he was never in the military. And Max Brooks was just an author who came up with a concept and was writing about this concept and how it changed the world. It was obviously pro-Jewish, but in a very real sense, it was pro-human in many respects. Max Brooks is the son of a comedian. He's not somebody who's as politically motivated or as indoctrinated as many people. So if you ever read World War Z, you'll notice that Max Brooks, in the book, is basically positing the opposite of what I'm saying for Israel. He's positing a Israel in the aftermath of a zombie apocalypse, in which there is a bilateral nation, a kind of Israel-Palestine that's created, in which apartheid is done away with, and Israelis and Palestinians are living together in a single state system in peace, under still a democracy. That, of course, is entirely utopian, precious at best, certainly naive, and very unrealistic. But nevertheless, that is not a realistic solution, but is supposed to be something that would evolve out of an incredibly complex series of catastrophes that are, until that point in history, literally inconceivable. So Max Brooks did not write the film. Max Brooks, of course, wanted to make money. He sold the rights to the film.
Right.
And filmmakers took it and they ran with it to produce something completely different. And what they produced was far closer to the reality. If anyone in area launched incoming missiles at Israel, Israel is a nation state the size of Rhode Island. It is, for all intents and purposes, a one-bomb nation. All it takes is one good hit in one major strategic area, and you've effectively committed the second Holocaust and annihilated the majority of the the majority of the Jewish race on Earth. So, you know, because of that, obviously, with multiple incoming warheads, Israel is doomed. Their only hope is to maintain the neutron anti-ballistic missile system,
as a deterrent.
which, if they, as a deterrent, would head up into the sky and basically intercept the incoming ICBM, scramble their brains, so that none of them would reach Israel. But what happens simultaneously? Simultaneously, the effect is the Israelis generate the zombie apocalypse.
Wow.
So the only nation state that would stand at that point, outside of hordes of hundreds of millions of zombies surrounding Israel, would be the Israelis themselves behind their wall.
I know.
That is why World War Z was produced, to prepare Americans for what the Israelis planned.
Complete sense now. I've always, whenever I write an article or anything having to do with the zombies apocalypse, I always go back to that movie, and I always go back to that scene. And now there was a piece missing, and thank you. You just gave it to me.
Well,
wow.
That's certainly why we desperately need to rehabilitate and reform and change the state of Israel so it's no longer a threat to the world. This is why I recommend the conservative solution of establishing a monarchy that would tie them diplomatically to Britain, where any action committed on their part would have to be with British consultation. And if we do the same with the deconstruction and elimination of the House of Saud and the reestablishment of the rightful Hashemi dynasty over the Arabian Peninsula as guardians of the most holy sites of Al-Makkah and Al-Madinah, our world will be in for a much more peaceful age. If not a golden age, based on at least a lack of conflict in Southwest Asia, what Americans refer to as the Middle East. So this, I think, is very important to consider. Definitely, many changes have to be made. The Israelis would not at that point be able to claim they need to maintain such an enormous military, because at that point they would be basically, in a very real sense, an ally, and beyond that, basically an extension of England itself. They would be like Gibraltar. And so at that point, they would have English forces in nation that would be aiding with their defense. This would lead to far more responsible actions, because everything they do would have to have repercussions within the English Commonwealth of Nations. It's very important to remember that the Commonwealth of Nations is actually got many people who are applying for membership, and this is, of course, the British Commonwealth system. Two of those nations which are applying for membership in the British Commonwealth system are both Israel and Palestine. So the establishment of a British monarchy under a Rothschild dynasty in Israel would give everybody something to lose, and the Rothschilds themselves in particular, with a stake they would hold in their dynastic line now being recognized in the same way that the House of Saud is currently misrecognized, and wrongly so, by the Americans. So this is something that can lead to a, by the way, it's very important to emphasize that the Hashemi dynasty, the kings of the House of Jordan, all members of their royal family train at Sandhurst Military Academy in England anyway. They all speak perfect King's English as opposed to the President's English or American English. And so we have a system that's already possible to instate that would replace the threat of a zombie apocalypse and an American-engendered Armageddon based on American Zionism and Jew worship. I can't understand what could be more reasonable than that. And so I'm very happy that I've been able to articulate that today. And I'm hoping, of course, that we'll have an opportunity to speak together again in the future. Absolutely.
I want to thank you. You've blown my mind. And I have to say that, I've listened to you speak several times, but you said some things different today that just made sense to me, and it just clicked, and I want to thank you for that. I truly do. And I want to invite you back on the show sometime to speak further on this topic of the zombie apocalypse, because this is actually one of the things that I've been studying for a number of years. So
I'll be happy to do so. Yeah. And I'll be happy to go into detail of, that was actually the first subject to which I ever spoke to, was that very subject, as a matter of fact. Actually, it was actually the second. The first thing I spoke to was about many medical records that had been smuggled out of the former Soviet Union, in which the Soviet state system recognized the reality of vampires. Different subject we could go into happily, possibly on the same show.
Absolutely. There you go. Two of my most favorite topics to research. Yeah, wow. Thank you so much.
Well, I want to thank you very much. I'm sorry that our Skype camera appears to have stalled.
Yeah, it's been. We also had a few technical difficulties at the top of the show. I did clear them out without having to restart the stream, which I'm glad about. So, but we will.
I'm hoping, of course, this is recorded so that we'll be able to.
It is.
For people who have missed today's show. Wonderful.
Absolutely, it'll be uploaded onto my channel as soon as we're done. It'll probably take a little while because we're going on 3 hours here. But I really, truly want to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule and to talk with everybody tonight.
The honor is mine and the privilege, Lori Alexander. I want to wish you the best for all that you care for as well. And thank goodness that you seem to be getting better. Take care of your own health with the flu that you caught. And I definitely look forward to returning again. I'm certain that my Executrix producer can be contacted by yourself and we can arrange for something as soon as convenient for the both of you.
Oh, awesome. Thank you so much.
I would like to bring to people. Oh, I'm sorry.
Nope, go ahead.
Just going to.
No, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. It's
been absolutely great. It's been some amazing information out there. You know, there's just, I mean, especially with the zombie apocalypse stuff. I mean, a lot of that fits biblically as well. You know, that people don't seem to understand.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's absolutely amazing stuff.
Oh, bless you. Thank you so much, Robbie D. I do want people to know that Robbie D is also known as the original detonator, and certainly glad to have a man with a DJ sense of artistry with us tonight. And I want to remind everyone that I do have my own radio programs on Revolution Radio. And these are on both Tuesday and Saturday nights at the same time. That we have, of course, the Underground Resistance Network on the days in which they broadcast, which are usually a day like today is Sunday. They're usually doing their YouTube transmissions on Sunday nights, but it's at the same time, 10 to midnight Eastern, that my shows are on Tuesdays and Saturdays. Cool. So happy to say that we don't seem to be, have any schedule conflicts there. Yeah. So do check in to www.freedomslips.com, as in from Freedom's Lips to Your Ears, on Tuesday and Saturday nights at 10 to midnight. Saturday nights, it's the Saturday Night Firing Lines. On Tuesday nights, it's topical, it's critical omissions. But either nights, I speak to any number of topics. And I do want to remind people I will be in the Kon-Tiki Restaurant and Lounge on 4625 East Broadway in Tucson, Arizona, to represent Roswell and the Rising Sun. So anyone is welcome to go there. It's $20 at the door, but all you need to do is check out for reservation of tickets, since it's going to be November 11th, quite some time from now. You can make some plans to travel down there on November 11th, and then we will be able to hopefully meet, if anyone wants to personally meet myself, and you can reserve those tickets ahead of time by checking out manofthesoil.com. It's all one word, no dots, no dashes, no spaces within the Man of the Soil part, and then manofthesoil.com, because my main sponsor has been responsible for landscape and landscape building and landscape architecture for many years in Arizona. So we were happy to get Ben Estenius, the sponsor there, who also runs the Tucson Murder True Crime Tours, which people can check out at the TucsonMurders.com. And just check out as well manofthesoil.com to find out all the details you need about the Kon-Tiki Lounge. I'm just going to go over to my calendar for a second because I have a hard time remembering exactly what dates these fall on in terms of the days. And so November 11th will be a Friday night. So it'll be a Friday evening. And so that should be a good start for anyone going down to the Arizona region. And I'll be there again on Saturday to do my transmission of Saturday Night Firing Lines from the Kon-Tiki Polynesian Supper Club. When people can walk in there for free to witness that, and of course speak with myself and ask me questions on air. I want to thank as well the both of you for all that you've done to promote truth and reality in a world that's very propagandized and ideologically indoctrinated. And I want to thank Lori Alexander and Johnny D for everything they do to hold up the torch in a world that has very little understanding of not only the faith that many people proclaim they uphold, but in the history of the world that has developed since our change in the calendar, since the coming of the Christ, and you're helping to educate people in a sane and sensible way to deal with their faith that I don't see many people doing. So I very deeply appreciate that.
Oh, no, thank you. I appreciate you. The information you put out there is just, it's enlightening, it's eye-opening. People are finally waking up to the realities that you're putting out there, and they're hungry for the information that you have, Mr. Dietrich. I want to thank you. I'm going to put the links that you've given me into the description area below this video when I finish uploading it, and so you guys will have that. And I am actually seeing that it's so far in advance. I'm going to actually try to get to Phoenix or to Arizona that time frame in November. So,
well, that'd be fabulous.
Absolutely.
I would be honored to see you. It would be a privilege.
It's far enough ahead. We can make arrangements to get there with our business. So, yeah.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You know, guys, check out his show. Like I said, I'm gonna put the links in the description area below. I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. I want to especially thank Mr. Dietrich for taking time out of his busy schedule and coming in and speaking with us. Robbie, where can we find you?
Well, you can find me at the Ultimate Hebrew Israelite Awakening, which is quite appropriate. Since we're in the celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles, which is in line with the Enoch calendar, we are actually going to be doing a series of shows this week.
That's right, this week.
From Tuesday to Thursday.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to add the missing piece. We're actually going to go through the biblical history and the historical facts of who the original Hebrew Israelites were and are to this day. Right. We're going to actually go and trace through that history timeline from the beginning to the modern, to right now to the modern day, and it fits in quite perfectly with this show.
Does.
So
Absolutely.
you know, it's great.
Absolutely.
You can also find me at Illuminati Soldiers of Truth, and you can find me at Exposing Satanic World Government.
That's right. That's where you guys can find me, over at Exposing Satanic World Government. You can find me at the Ultimate Israelite Hebrew Israelite Awakening, and you can also find me on Spitfire and the Sentinels, and that's Wednesday afternoons, and it's supposed to be Sunday nights, but we kind of took their place today. We apologize. Sunday, Monday nights, I think it is, and Wednesday afternoons on Spitfire and the Sentinels. So I want to thank everybody in the chat room. I want to thank everybody joining us. Thank you, Robbie D, and a special thanks to our special guest tonight, Douglas Dwayne Dietrich. Thank you guys for everything, and until next time, speak the truth, even if your voice shakes. God bless you guys. Bye-bye.